This experience happened to me in Fort Worth, Texas in the year 2003, when I was still a sophomore in my high school. Me, my brother Chris, and a friend of ours who for the sake of the story I will call Robert, were all bored one day in the fall and decided to go explore a tunnel that led into the sewers under a bridge just because we had nothing better to do. The day that we did this, it was sort of a last-minute kind of thing. Not very much planning or thought was put into it. Anyways, this is how I remember it happening all these years later. My brother Chris had invited our friend Robert over after school. We wanted to do something different this time aside from just playing video games. We suggested that we all go outside and go walking in the field behind our house, and as we did that, we decided to cross the street beyond the field, where there was a pretty busy street with traffic throughout the day. After jaywalking across, we walked towards the bridge underpass. We carefully walked down into the swamp under the bridge, trying not to slide into the dirty-looking water below. We saw lots of graffiti down there, and a tunnel opening to the sewers, and we thought, why not go exploring? We thought we would be safe as a trio, so my brother Chris entered first, me being in the middle and Robert at the rear. The tunnel wasn't wide enough for us to walk side by side. It was so narrow that we had to walk single file in a straight line. We used the lights on our cell phones. Now let me clarify that this was before smartphones and iPhones, so the lights on our cell phone screens were all that we had to navigate. We had some light peering through the outside from the sewer grates above, but it wasn't really much to make a difference. We traveled at a reasonable pace, seeing a lot of graffiti on both sides of us as we walked. Nothing out of the ordinary occurred as we made our way down. We heard a lot of cars passing on the street above us. Everything sounded and looked okay for the most part. Then we got to the end of the tunnel. It led into a room with a sewer manhole with the lid closed, and two more tunnel openings, one on the left and the other on the right. Now, you would expect this room to be covered in graffiti, but strangely, there were only 3 words spray painted in white: the wrong way. Now, it was at this moment that we all started to feel a bit on edge, as if someone that was concealed by the surrounding darkness was watching us. We immediately started hearing sounds from the other tunnels. There came a torrent of what sounded like voices crying out in agony, along with loud stomping footsteps, as if someone in boots was making their way towards us. The horrific sounds emanating from the tunnels were distorted and seemed to bounce off the walls around us. It reminded me of the scene in The Haunting of Hell House, where the 2 leads of the movie started hearing footsteps of a ghost before it starts pounding on their bedroom door. We all immediately turned around and ran back the way we had come from. As before, Chris was in front. I was in the middle, and Robert at the rear. We all were terrified that someone was right behind us, as the relentless footsteps picked up their pace. I remember Robert was kind of pushing and shoving me, because he was probably the most terrified, being at the very back. As we ran, the hellish torrent of voices seemed to intensify, then they all suddenly ceased at once. We made it out of the opening of the tunnel, and immediately made our way back to the top of the bridge, never looking back. As soon as we felt that we were safe, we finally stopped to catch our breath, and then we talked about what happened for hours. We came to the conclusion that it was probably just some homeless people living down there. They probably heard us and set off to scare us in the only way they could, and the ominous graffiti sign, "the wrong way," was probably put up by them as a warning to stay away. Regardless of what happened, we never did anything like that again. I have not been to that sewer tunnel since, nor do I ever plan to. In all these years, I've never told this story to anyone. To all you young kids out there who are bored and want to find something to do yourself a favor and stay away from sewer tunnels. You never know what you're going to find or hear down there. Back in the spring of 1999, when I was 16, my family moved to a small mountain town in Colorado. I didn't mind the surrounding forests or the isolation at all, because I was already an outdoorsy type of person. I enjoyed hiking up hills and wandering down dirt paths. I quickly became friends with the only other kid my age who lived nearby. His name was Kyle. One evening, shortly before the start of summer, Kyle and I had been wandering through the woods and found a narrow river that flowed across the property. Being bored kids, our immediate reaction was to jump in and swim upstream and have fun. We kept at it until sundown. but instead of packing it in, set them down on the riverbank and keep swimming. After maybe another 10 minutes, Kyle became very quiet and gestured for me to swim closer to him. When I was within arm's reach, he whispered to me, "Look over my shoulder, towards the tree line. I think someone is there pacing back and forth." I would have immediately dismissed his words as just him jumping at shadows, but the genuine concern in his voice made me pause. I glanced over to where he had indicated and scanned the tree line for a few wary seconds, but didn't notice anything moving. I said something to the effect of, "It's either an animal or just shadows, dude. No one has any business being on this property, and I doubt anyone else knows about this section of river." That didn't seem to put Kyle's mind at ease at all. He turned back around and looked towards the tree line again, and for a moment, there was complete silence. "Did you just hear that?" Kyle asked. I told him that I didn't hear anything. Kyle asked if I would walk up to the bank with him and investigate to see if there was anything there. I told him if we got out, we wouldn't want to go back in, and I kinda wanted to swim some more. Kyle didn't respond, but instead swam out towards the bank and climbed out of the water. I continued to swim like a moronic kid, oblivious to the notion that me diving forward into the water in the dark could have resulted in me caving my head in on a hidden rock or something. I'm not sure how much time passed before I suddenly began to feel very alone. I turned back towards the bank, and I didn't see Kyle anywhere. Both of the flashlights were still untouched, lying in the sand by our shoes. I called out for Kyle as I climbed out of the water, but he didn't seem to respond. I picked up my flashlight and scanned the trees with the beam. I called out for Kyle again, half convinced that he was just messing with me. But again, silence was the only response. I took a few careful steps into the woods, around the area that Kyle had pointed out earlier. I was getting ready to call his name out again when I noticed him. He was standing facing away from me several yards away, staring deeper into the forest. I walked over to him, but he didn't turn towards me as I moved closer. I shouted something along the lines of, "Kyle, you jerk! Why aren't you answering me?" I reached out to grab his shoulder, but before I could, he slowly raised one hand and pointed a trembling finger towards the shadows. "Can you see that? What is that?" I shined the flashlight at his face. I could see that he was bone white, and his eyes were as wide as sewer covers. I barely noticed it at the time, but one detail I'll never be able to forget was a single droplet of blood running down from his nose. I turned the light in the direction that he was pointing and asked, "What?" It was like time had stopped. My flashlight beam caught a pair of legs in dark pants, and I felt my heart skip a beat. The flashlight felt extremely heavy in that moment, and if I were in any other circumstances, I would have snapped the beam light upwards immediately. But all I could do was slowly raise my arm, as if I was fighting gravity itself. The legs simply kept going, then the torso appeared. When my flashlight traveled all the way up past its chin, it had a very wide and gummy smile. It was the scariest face I had ever seen. I flipped my shit and dropped my flashlight. I collided with Kyle as I turned, and we both hit the ground. I screamed for him to run. Then I took off like a maniac back down the river and back at the path we had taken, abandoning everything else, including my friend. I lost count of how many times I tripped. It was at least 6, maybe as many as 10. But I continued to leap back to my feet and kept sprinting, using only the starlight through the overhead branches and the distant glow of indoor lights where my house was to navigate. I didn't say anything to Kyle. I was certain that I could hear him only a few steps behind me, crashing around the sticks just as loudly as I was. I shot through the garage door into the kitchen, screaming bloody murder. My arms and face were bruised and bloody, and at some point, I had lost one of my sneakers. But I barely registered that as I cried for my parents to call the police. I looked around behind me for Kyle, but he wasn't there. Assuming that he had run back to his own house, I asked my parents to call his parents after the police arrived. I was shaking so badly when the cops came, and they seemed concerned that I might have been overdosing on something. Then we got the phone call from Kyle's parents, and they were checking to see if Kyle had come home with me. and the police called in a team of dogs and extra men to scan the area. They located our belongings by the river, but they found no trace of Kyle or the stranger. The search lasted months, and over 100 miles worth of forest was searched, but no trace of him was ever found. To this day, Kyle has never been seen again. There was media coverage at the time, but given that we were in a small town where people get lost in the woods often, I don't know how far the story spread. What is probably the most heartbreaking is that Kyle's family is still without any answers. I live with the guilt of his disappearance every day. I doubt that I'll ever forgive myself for not stopping to make sure that he was behind me. To this day, I'm sure I can recall the sound of his footsteps behind me as I ran, so I don't know at what point he stopped, or if the thing grabbed him. Another thought has crossed my mind numerous times. What if it wasn't Kyle that I heard behind me? I'm a 14-year-old girl from Ireland. A few months ago, before my family moved houses, we lived in kind of a bad neighborhood where a lot of crime took place. One day I traveled by train to get to my cousin's house, as the journey would be too long on foot and I had to be there at a certain time. I scanned my ticket, sat down, and began reading a book I had brought with me. From somewhere nearby, I heard these strange sobbing sounds and someone panting as though they were having an anxiety attack. I tried ignoring it, but it just got worse. Eventually, I looked up and saw a young woman who looked to be in her early to late 20s, crying with her head in her hands. I immediately got up and asked if she was alright. She then sat up and looked at me. I remember the petrified look on her face and her eyes being full of tears, and she was shaking. I was also wondering why the hell everyone else on the train was just sitting there, because apart from the passengers with headphones in their ears, they could all hear her. She never answered me. After we locked eyes, she abruptly sprinted to another seat, about 2 rows up from where she was before. She began staring at the ground, with her long hair falling over her shoulders and face. I was worried that I had upset her even more, and assumed that she wanted to be left alone. Whatever was wrong with her was private. So I sat back down and tried reading again, but I couldn't take my mind off of what just happened. It honestly made me shiver to the point where I became paranoid for the rest of the ride. After the next 2 stops, I looked around, since I didn't hear any more crying. She was gone, and I assumed that she had gotten off. The next stop was mine. As I was walking to my cousin's house, I kept thinking about the woman I had encountered, wishing that I had acted differently. The next day, after I got back home, I was scrolling through my news feed when I came across an article about a 32-year-old journalist named Jennifer, who had been found dead and mutilated just 2 streets away from the train station. I saw a picture, and I almost dropped my phone as my heart stopped. It was her. I recognized her face and hair. There was also a graphic censored image of her body. According to the story, her body was found gutted and soaked in blood, with her clothes torn to shreds. Her innards were strewn about her dismembered corpse, and she looked as though she had been dead for a while. This made me sick. I wish I had never clicked on that story. Later that night, I saw many more bigger news networks covering it. Last I heard, they never found out who did it, but apparently she had been sexually assaulted before being killed. An anonymous witness later told the police that he had seen her crying on the train. I felt extremely sorry for this poor girl, for the horrific accounts of agony she must have gone through. She must have had some idea what was going to happen to her, for her to be crying like that. It still shakes me to my core thinking back on this. I told my mother, and she reported what I saw to the police. She never wanted me to take the train again after that. My cousin told me that before anyone else arrived at her house the night I came over, she had seen a suspicious-looking man in what looked to be jeans and a black hoodie, slowly walking past their house. She didn't see his face and didn't think much of it at the time. After she found out what happened, she became traumatized and didn't go out for weeks afterwards, not even to go to school. I hope that woman rests in peace and that her family finds justice. I'll never look or think of a train in the same way again. I live in North Hollywood, California. My brother and I live together in a nice, quiet neighborhood where not even car break-ins happen. Trust me, In North Hollywood, there aren't many neighborhoods like that. A few years ago, my next-door neighbor, Jillian, adopted a dog to keep her older dog company while she was at work. I work from home, so she would often ask me to let her dogs out around lunch, and sometimes again around 4 p.m. if she was working late. One day Jillian called and said she had a meeting after work and asked if I could go over twice that day. I said yes, and at around 12 p.m. I went over for my first visit. Now, I should explain the basic layout of Jillian's house. As you walk through the front door, it's a pretty straight shot from the door, through the living room and dining room to get to the back door, which obviously leads into the backyard. The bedrooms and bathroom were on the left side of the house, and the kitchen was on the right side. Jillian always closes the doors, leaving just the dining room and living room for the dogs to hang out in. As I made my way through, I noticed that all the doors were closed as usual, and greeted the dogs and took them into the backyard to do their business and run around. While we were outside, I couldn't help but shake the feeling that I was being watched. I started to feel very uneasy. I heard the dogs back inside as calmly as I could, made sure everything was locked up, and then I walked home. At around 4 p.m., I started back over for my second visit, and as I approached the front door and put the key in, I had this sinking feeling in my chest. I shrugged it off and went inside so I could take care of the dogs. As I walked over to them, I noticed that one of the bedroom doors was wide open. I let the dogs out and started thinking back to my first visit. I was fairly certain that the doors were all closed. I thought to myself, maybe Jillian forgot something and came back to the house and forgot to tell me. I pulled out my phone and called her. "Hey, did you come back home earlier? I'm here to let the dogs out and I saw that your bedroom door was open." What she said next chilled me to the bone. "No, I'm just getting in my car to head home now. Why?" I wanted to run and scream, but I decided to act as normal as possible, because I didn't know if whoever opened the bedroom door was still in the house. I told Jillian that I was calling the cops and hung up. I left the dogs in the backyard and went back inside and said aloud as calmly as I could, "Bye guys, see you tomorrow." But as I exited the house and started to dial 911, I heard Jillian's front door open, and a tall, thin man, I would say about in his 30s, emerged from the doorway and began to run towards me. I ran as fast as I could to my door, which wasn't locked. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, and that's when I heard from the other side of the door,
"I'm coming for you, bitch."
Before I could hit the call button, I heard a window break in the kitchen. I realized that my brother was not home and had to fend for myself. I ran into my brother's room, went through his closet and found a baseball bat. I could now hear the guy walking around my house looking for me. He came into my brother's room and looked under the bed. I stood up from my place in the closet and prepared for him to find me. I was sobbing as quietly as I could and praying that I would get a swing in before he got me. He stood up and made his way over to the closet. He opened the door and I swung and hit him in the chest. He fell to the ground, but managed to get right back up and knocked the bat out of my hands and then shoved me to the ground. He then started dragging me out of the room. There in the hallway he met my brother, who had a knife. He had come home after he realized that he forgot his wallet. He stabbed the guy in his shoulder, and the intruder moaned as he fell to the floor. My brother kicked him in the face and told me to call the cops. Just then I heard sirens outside. Jillian had called the cops right after we had hung up. She knew that it was her crazy ex-husband who had broken into her house. The cops dragged the man out of my house, but later confessed that he had planned on killing Jillian, but heard that I had called her, so he decided to kill me and anyone else in my house as well. He was not well in the head, if you catch my drift. I hate to think of what would have happened to me if my brother hadn't forgot his wallet. This happened when I was 15. My dad and I were driving my sister from San Diego to Austin, Texas, where she would start her new job. She had lived in Guam for a year, and she couldn't afford to ship her car all the way to Texas, only to California. So my dad and I loaded up her car and began the drive all the way to the Lone Star State. We had been going for a few hours and decided to stop in El Centro to get some gas and use the bathroom. I didn't have to go, so I volunteered to pump the gas, as my dad and sister went inside. There were a few other cars at the pumps and in the parking lot. There was a man about 5'10", average size. He was at the pump adjacent to ours. As soon as I threw some trash away, he began giving me this look of sheer malice and hate. Being the unathletic turd that I am, I was slightly intimidated, My father walked out of the store and told me that he bought $35 worth of gas. He didn't seem to notice the strange man staring at me as he climbed in the driver's seat. He was looking at his phone. I began to pump the gas and tried to make the best of the situation. My sister walked out of the store and I averted my eyes to look at her. And then I saw from my peripheral vision the man reaching into his pocket and producing a knife. He then harshly whispered to me to get into his car or he was going to stab me. I went in full defense mode and shoved the guy as hard as I could, knocking him off balance. He hit the gas hose that connected to his car, spraying him in gasoline. As he fell backward, I hung up my gas hose and yelled at my sister to get into the car and for my dad to fire it up. We jumped in the car, and I think my dad saw the knife because he floored it the hell out of there. I saw the guy jump into his white Chevy and turn it on, but by that time, we were already out of the station and going back to the interstate. I told Dad what happened, and he drove even faster to get back to the interstate. I then looked out of the back window and saw the same white Chevy weaving in between traffic, seemingly chasing after us. He pulled up next to us, and that's when I saw that there was someone else in the passenger seat. The passenger rolled down his window and pointed a handgun at us, screaming at us to pull over. Instead, my dad hit the gas, bringing us up to almost 100 miles per hour. The Chevy was still next to us. Suddenly, my dad shouted at me and my sister to get down and brace ourselves. The Chevy then abruptly swerved and sideswiped us, but the collision caused them to lose focus, sending them into the far lane, where they hit the back of a semi going at least 90. As we sped away, we saw that their whole front end was smashed, and they were forced to pull over. We got off the next exit and went to a police station, and reported the incident. After about an hour, they told us they found the broken down Chevy. Both the assailants had left it behind and had fled on foot, even before the truck driver could get out of his rig. Apparently, when I described the appearance of the guy, the police knew that he was a serial offender and had reports of him luring children into his car across the Southwest and bringing them back to Mexico. He was wanted on several counts of kidnapping. After a few days, we were able to continue our move to Texas, and the rest of the trip went off without a hitch. I am a 22-year-old female from South Texas. The town where I live in is small and is still growing, and due to the lack of entertainment, we sometimes go to Houston or one of the other big cities nearby. Given the situation, my family decided to surprise me with tickets to a concert to one of my favorite artists, and I would be joined by my sister. I was excited and thought it would be a great time. It was a 3-hour drive there and back. We had a wedding to go to the next day, so we decided to save some time and take some back roads. I wish we could have stayed at the hotel. After the amazing concert, we decided to get some Taco Bell and head back. Mind you, this was around 11:30 p.m. Everything was going fine until the low tire pressure light came on. My sister pulled over and got out of the car to check things out. I could hear her curse. The tire was not only low on pressure, but completely deflated. My sister and I were both raised to be independent. You can save a few extra bucks on things by doing them yourself. So it goes without saying that we knew how to change a tire. While we were in the process, there was a man that emerged from a nearby tree line. He was about 6 foot tall. What really caught my eye was how well he was dressed. He wore a suit and had this creepy smile. He walked up to us and offered to help. We kindly denied, but he just stood there and continued to stare at us. We made up a white lie and said that our parents were on the way and they would be here any second to help us. We told him this in the hopes that he would just leave, and he eventually did, and just turned around and walked back into the tree line without saying another word. I thought it was weird how he came out of the tree line at the perfect time. Just when we thought it was over, the same man comes back out, except this time, there was a knife in his hand, and he was wearing a black mask. I freak out as he runs up to our car and sinks his knife into the rear passenger side tire. Me and my sister scramble into the car through the driver's side doors, and we lock it just in time. That's when a white truck pulls up behind us. We thought it was someone coming to help us, but that's when we saw 3 more men wearing black masks exit the truck and surround our car. The 3 men start banging on the windows, while the guy with the suit gets on top of the hood and began to drag his knife across the windshield. making this awful scratching sound. At this point, we had called the cops, but there was no sign of them showing up anytime soon. One of the men banged on the window so hard, I thought it was going to break. That's when the man in the suit jumps down off the hood and reaches into his suit and pulls out a gun. I thought that we were dead in that instant. I began to pray while my sister started screaming hysterically. The guy walks up to the rear passenger side window, points his gun, and shoots, sending shards all over the back seat. The first shot didn't break the glass enough, so he pulled the trigger again. My heart has never raced so fast in my life. The masked man used his gun to move away some of the remaining glass and unlock the back door. During all this commotion, I had retrieved my pepper spray from my travel bag. The man made his way inside the car, and at that moment I suddenly turned around and practically emptied the entire bottle in his face. The man immediately put his free hand over his eyes and began to scream. He pointed the gun at my sister, and at that moment I couldn't breathe. It was like the entire world froze. But for whatever reason, the man didn't pull the trigger. And that's when I heard the fast approaching police sirens. The masked men fled and jumped back into their truck, and within seconds, we saw their taillights disappearing into the night. The police arrived too late, but we gave our report. I tried my best to give a description, but most of what came out of my mouth was gibberish. I was obviously pretty shaken up over what happened. The police combed the area, and it turns out we were at the wrong place at the wrong time. These men had set up nails on the road and were waiting for their next victim. They were possibly human traffickers. The police put out an APB on the truck, but as far as I know, they never found the men responsible. Always be careful when you're driving on the back roads of Texas. These men could still be out there, looking for their next victims. And always be sure to bring something with you to protect yourself. It just might save your life. Before I begin my story, I would like to send my thoughts and prayers to anybody who has been the victim of stalking or harassment. I know firsthand how it feels to have eyes constantly watching you. This experience still haunts me to this day. My name is Jackson. When this happened, I was a freshman out of Texas. I used to go to a vocational school instead of a regular high school. Vocational schools have what I like to call a rotation cycle. For a week, you have regular classes like math and English, science and history, among a few other electives. The next week, you'll have math and English, but after that you go to a shop class for the rest of the day. Adam is the definition of a kid who no one wants to be around. He's always on his phone, thinks he's smarter than everyone else, failing every class, wears pants under his ass, and worst of all, he has this god-awful laugh. It first started in academic classes. I was on my way to math, and he was walking past me in the opposite direction. "Sup, Jackson?" he said while giving me an upward nod. I took it as a friendly gesture, returned his nod, and kept walking. I don't know why, but I feel like I had to look back. I was surprised to find Adam was staring at me, and I quickly ducked into my math class. English class was next. Adam is in my English class and sits next to me. I sat down in class and took out my notes. Adam walked in, and I let out an exaggerated sigh. I began to write my answer for the day's prompt. After a few minutes of English, I began to get this feeling like I was being watched. I glanced out of the corner of my eye and saw that Adam was staring daggers at me with these blank, dead eyes. I turned my attention back to the lesson. 15 minutes go by, and the feeling washed over me again. I looked in Adam's direction, and he was still staring at me. His chair also appeared to be closer than it was before. I figured that he shifted his body and his chair moved closer as a result. After English, Adam and I had one other class together, Foundations in Technical Math. It was my last class of the day. I sat down and took out my laptop. "Hello, Jackson," a familiar voice said. I turned to face my teacher, Mr. Campbell. Mr. Campbell was a very helpful teacher. I would often stay after school and get extra work done. Adam walked into the room and made his way past me, dragging his tattered hoodie against the back of my neck. We sat on opposite sides of the classroom. so interaction between us was minimized. Finally, the bell rang. I picked up my stuff and walked out. While most of the students walk through the cafeteria or the front entrance, I would take an exit that's around the side entrance that's rarely used. As I'm walking towards my bus, I see Adam staring at me. I didn't see him that weekend, though I mostly kept to myself. Monday rolled around before I was ready for it, and it was back to the grind. I had just walked into my programming classroom. My teacher gave me a friendly smile, as he always did. After everyone got into shop, the teacher announced that we would be getting a new student. I was excited at the possibility of making a new friend, but all that changed when Adam showed his face. He came in with a goofy shit-eating grin. Adam sat down next to me and scooted uncomfortably close. "Sup, Jackson?" Adam said with his stupid, obnoxious laugh. I pushed his chair away from me with my foot. The rest of the shop was uneventful, as Adam was getting the rundown from the teacher. When the bell rang and everyone left, the teacher pulled me aside. "Jackson, is everything okay?" he asked, giving me a once-over. I guess he noticed my disposition during the entire class. At that moment, I knew I could no longer hide my frustration. I shook my head and told him about Adam's unnerving behavior. Unfortunately, Adam was not sent to the dean's office, but he said that he would make sure that we weren't partners on anything. I thanked him for that and went to get on my bus. On my way to the bus, I turned around to see that Adam was following me, not casually going in the same direction. It was like he was following me and trying not to be noticed. I got on the bus and looked out the window to see Adam giving me that cold, dead stare once again. At this point, my mind was racing. What the hell is this guy's deal? Is he obsessed with me? Does he want a relationship? Does he want to kill me? Later that night, I was hanging out in my basement playing Xbox when a tap came from the storm door. I looked at the position of the locks. Thankfully, they were secured. I decided to look through the peephole just in case. No one was on the other side of the door. I ran up to the ground level windows and peered out into the darkness. No one was on the porch, but there was someone in a hoodie walking down the street. At the time, I didn't put two and two together, but I did have a sinking feeling in my stomach. The next time I saw Adam was in my Thursday algebra class. I was sitting in my seat taking notes when Adam walked in and sat down at my table. He didn't take out a laptop or a notebook. He just sat down and stared at the board. I glanced over at Adam, only to be met by his blank eyes. The teacher noticed Adam's odd behavior and sent him to a table in the back. For the rest of the class, I felt Adam's eyes on me the whole time. My algebra teacher pulled me aside after class and asked me about Adam. At this point, all my teachers were starting to notice Adam's odd behavior towards me. Fast forward a few months, and Adam's obsession was in full swing. He would always stare at me and make comments like, "I love you," and "We'll be together forever." These remarks became even worse after Adam realized that I wasn't interested. I just don't swing that way. The situation became almost unbearable, and I began to reach my breaking point. As a result of Adam's behavior, he lost a friend of his, and it turns out me and Adam's former friend both loved to fish. That April, his friend Derek and I went on a fishing trip with my father. We stayed at this crappy motel during the trip, and then we dropped off Derek at his house. At about 3:12 in the morning, my phone buzzed. I grabbed it off my nightstand, still half asleep, and checked it. The message was from an unknown number, but I had a feeling that I knew who it was. The message simply said, "Hello." I didn't pay it much mind and tried to go back to sleep, but a few seconds later, another message came through. "Is this your house?" A picture dropped under the message. It took me a moment to process the picture, but my heart stopped when I was able to make out that it was a photo of my house. I crawled on my hands and knees down the stairs to avoid detection. About halfway down, I was able to see through one of the windows a person in a hoodie standing in my front lawn. The mysterious person's face could not be seen from where I was. I cursed under my breath, and my phone went off again. The message read, "I see you, Jackson. I scrambled back upstairs to my room. I stayed in my room for what felt like an eternity before I even thought to peek out my window. I didn't see anything as I looked over the yard. I didn't go back to sleep that night. At this point, Adam was pestering me almost every day. I had made several complaints against him, but nothing was ever done. As annoying and creepy as Adam was, I knew I could tough out freshman year, as long as this didn't escalate further. How wrong I was. One day in Foundations class, Adam was sitting directly behind me. He scooted so close that I could hear his breathing. I felt something graze the back of my neck. I turned around to see Adam staring at me with his stupid shit-eating grin. "That's it!" I yelled. At this point, I had had enough. I spun around and grabbed Adam by the collar. Adam was laughing like a jackass, while everyone else in the room stared at us. "Take it easy, Jackson. It's just a joke." I was practically screaming at Adam when Mr. Campbell walked in. "Take it easy? That's the only thing you can say after joining my shop to follow me? Coming to my house in the middle of the night? Stealing my phone number and harassing me constantly? Why don't you just leave me the hell alone?" Mr. Campbell got between us and ended up sending Adam to the principal's office. After class, Mr. Campbell pulled me aside and warned me about using physical force to deal with my problems, although I was driven to that point because the school administration decided to do absolutely nothing about Adam's unwanted advances. Over the remaining 6 months of school, Adam kept harassing me. A decent chunk of the student body knew about the situation, and almost all of them sided with me, including 2 juniors on my bus named Colin and David. They were really good friends of mine. They both knew about the situation and did their best to help. Colin and David were in the shop next to mine. Every time class would let out and they saw Adam trying to get close, they made sure he backed off. I made it through my freshman year, and it was now summer break. It was a warm summer night. I was home alone, sitting in the kitchen, browsing the internet on my laptop, when my phone vibrated. I looked down at my phone. Again, it was a text from an unknown number. "I hope you'll forgive me." My heart rate raised a bit. At this point, I thought that Adam would have better things to do over summer break than to harass me, but my blood ran cold when I heard the sound of shattering glass from my living room. "Jackson, I'm here," he called out in his irritating voice, followed by his obnoxious laughter. My heart thundered in my chest. I crouched on my hands and knees and peered out from behind the counter, only to see Adam holding a knife in his left hand and duct tape in his right. My mind raced to think of a way to defend myself. Then it hit me. My dad had a .357 revolver in his nightstand. I always hated guns, but Adam left me with no choice. I slowly made my way towards the stairs. Walking up the steps was like crossing a minefield. When I put my weight on the top step, an awful creaking sound echoed throughout the house, giving away my location. I felt my whole world collapse in that very moment. If it wasn't for the heavy, unrelenting footsteps from Adam's boots crossing the living room, I probably wouldn't have found the courage to sprint into my parents' room and lock myself in. Moments after I locked the door, there came a pounding, and Adam started psychotically taunting me. "Come on, Jackson. It won't hurt much. I promise I'll make it quick." I knew that Adam had lost his mind. The door began to splinter due to Adam's pounding. I tried opening the drawer on the nightstand, but it wouldn't budge. I dug through a jar of change on my dad's desk, and I finally found the keys. I opened the nightstand and rapidly dug through the mess in the drawer. Right as I felt the handle of the gun, the bedroom door burst open, and Adam came charging in with a knife raised. "Now I've got you!" Adam lunged at me, stabbing me in my chest. I screamed, and the gun fell to the side. Adam pulled the knife out and brought it down again, but I managed to grab his wrist before he could stab me. It was now or never. It took every ounce of my strength to reach for the gun. My hand wrapped around the handle, and my fingers slipped over the trigger. I had no way of knowing if it was loaded or not. In one fluid motion, I pointed the gun against the side of Adam's neck and squeezed the trigger. There was a bright flash of light, and my ears rang. I looked around with the gun still in my hand and saw that Adam was now on his side, choking and gasping for breath. There was a massive hole in the side of his neck. He stared at me with his mouth open, and I watched as his life slipped away. I made my way downstairs, clutching my stab wound, and dialed 911. I don't remember much after that. I woke up in a hospital sometime later with my parents sitting next to me. I explained to them and the police the entire story, and made sure to tell them that the school did absolutely nothing about Adam for my entire freshman year. The legal situation was a bit messy, but due to the castle doctrine in my state, I didn't face any charges. I was in the hospital for another week before I was allowed to go home. I returned to school the following September as a sophomore, and everyone knew my story. I was mentally fucked up over what happened. Whenever I was asked about the ordeal, I always politely declined to talk about it. Adam's parents were pissed at me, accusing me of harassing him. They refused to accept the fact that Adam had major problems, and they ultimately failed as parents. I know that sounds harsh, but it's the truth. I'm now 25, and I'm engaged to my high school sweetheart, and we're actually expecting our first child. I don't regret what I did to Adam. When you make the stupid choice of breaking into someone's house with a knife, your life is forfeit. This happened to me and a friend of mine a couple years back at our local church. For the sake of the story, my name is Jamie, and we'll call my friend Mark. We were pretty young back then. I was 13 and Mark was only 12. This church is located in San Antonio, Texas, and also happens to be one of the oldest churches in the area. This all began around noon. We ended up hanging around church after Mass, waiting for our monthly youth meeting to begin, but we still had 2 hours to kill. We headed for a trail that went through the churchyard, but continued past the grounds into a nearby preservation. This trail was also commonly used by cyclists, but we walked these trails just to kill time and to feel a little rebellious in our young minds. As we walked by this bench that was no more than a minute into the trail, me and my friend noticed something on the bench. There was this dirty pillow, and there was no one nearby. "I dare you to take a nap and wait till someone wakes you up," Mark said jokingly. I wisely declined the offer. God only knows where that musty pillow has been. We assumed that it belonged to one of the many homeless people we've seen around town. Eventually, after we got done with our meeting, we headed back to Mark's house. His dad only lived about 7 minutes away, and we would usually walk there from church on the nights where I would be staying with Mark. This was one of the few days I actually got to spend the night at Mark's house. Mark's dad had to work early the next morning, and he was asleep by 10. And by midnight, me and Mark were still up, trying to figure out what we should do. "Bro, we gotta get out of here. Don't you want to do something else besides playing video games all night?" said Mark. I admitted that the games were getting kind of boring, but there was nothing else to do. "Well, what else do you have in mind?" I asked him. "Let's head to that trail that we like. We'll bring some flashlights and a pocket knife for protection." That sounded like a good idea to me, and I was eager to do something different, so I agreed to go. We would go out at night more often than you would probably think, but granted, we'd never been on the trail this late at night. We put on our sweaters, grabbed some of his dad's pocket knives, and some flashlights before going off exploring. As we walked down the dimly lit road, there was this feeling that something wasn't quite right settling in the pit of my stomach. I ignored the feeling and told myself I was being paranoid. As we approached the trail's opening, Mark shined his light through the trees. There were crickets chirping, along with the wind rustling the leaves. After about a minute or so of entering the trail, I thought I heard footsteps behind us. They seemed to slowly die down as we continued. Since this trail was about 3/4 of a mile long, it took a little while for us to reach the church grounds. While passing by the bench we encountered earlier that day, we discovered the old dirty pillow was still there. Mark said, "You can actually take a nap now if you want." I shrugged it off and told him, "Let's just get to the end so we can turn around and go home. This place has kind of given me the creeps." By the time we got to the end, I had forgotten all about the faint footsteps I heard earlier, and we turned around and headed back the way we came. At this point, we were a ways away from the bench, but still close enough to see it. We stopped in our tracks as we were startled by the sound of footsteps running. "The hell was that?" I said under my breath. But before I could figure out what to do, I noticed the pillow was now missing from the bench. I pointed it out to Mark, who was scanning the surrounding area with his flashlight. He pointed it to the bench, and as he did, we both noticed something standing behind a tree and a pair of eyes staring daggers at us. Mark quickly moved the light away and seemed to have the same idea I had. "We should act like we didn't see anything and go home the other way." I nodded and followed his lead. As we turned, we heard the sound of someone running at full speed right for us. Mark took off and I quickly followed behind him. The assailant was much faster than us and closing in. I grabbed Mark and pulled him to the side. After switching his light off, I told him in a quiet voice, "We should stay here and wait for him to pass and run back." We then heard the distinct sound of heavy breathing nearby and saw a large dark figure through the bushes. When we were sure the figure made its way past us, we made a break for Mark's house. We made it out of the trail and kept going. When we arrived at his house, we were out of breath and covered in sweat. To this day, we don't know who was waiting for us behind the tree, nor do we know what exactly he was planning on doing if he had caught us. Back in the summer of 2016, I got my first job at 18 years old. I was excited about the work, but not about the commute. Without traffic, it was a 30-minute drive both ways, and I normally got off work around midnight, and the last thing I wanted to do was drive a half hour to get home. During the first few weeks, I was still getting used to my new routine, and one of the first things my mother told me was to keep an eye on my gas tank, and if I ever needed more, I should leave early and stop on the way, but never on my way back. I understood her concern. I was a petite 18-year-old female, and I looked even younger. But being who I was, I half forgot, half ignored that advice. And one night on my way home, I realized I legitimately didn't have enough gas in the tank to get me to my exit. I pulled into the first station I could find, not caring about the brand or the cost of the gas. I decided to make it as quick as possible, and only put in about $10 worth, just to get myself out of there. The station was empty, and there were sketchy-looking people walking up and down the sidewalk, and about 20 different angles where someone could sneak up on me. I swiped my card and began pumping gas, and once it got to the $10 mark, I shut it off and printed out my receipt. Thinking the worst was behind me, I was about to climb back into my car and book it home, when a voice came from the tiny intercom above the pump. "Ma'am, there was a problem with your credit card payment." I paused and glanced at the guy at the counter and felt a chill spiral down my neck. He was one of those tall, gaunt, sketchy-looking clerks, and was staring right out the window at me, beckoning me to come inside. I stepped back towards the gas pump and pressed the button on the intercom. "What's wrong with my card? I have a receipt. It went through just fine." I didn't try to hide the annoyance in my voice. I didn't like the look of this guy, or the way he sounded. "I just need you to come inside, ma'am. Your receipt is incorrect. I'm going to need to run your card in here," he replied, a bit too quickly. I looked back at the guy through the window in frustration. There was no way I was going in there, where I would be alone with him. He was staring at me wide-eyed, like some kind of creep. I stood my ground, pulled out my phone, and checked my credit card app. I held it up stupidly as if he could see it from there, and I pressed the intercom button again. "It went through. I see it on my statement. I'm not coming in." "Ma'am, if you attempt to leave, I'll call the police. I have your tag number. Please come inside." I then shouted at him from across the parking lot instead of pressing the intercom. "Over $10 of gas, you're gonna call the cops? Fuck you. I'm leaving." I walked a few steps around my car and gave him the finger. I was just about to walk back around my car and climb into the driver's seat when I paused. He was mouthing something to me through the window. I would have ignored it, but he suddenly looked much more desperate than creepy. He kept beckoning me forward and calling out something that I couldn't hear through the window. I must have made a weird look, because 5 seconds later he slammed a piece of paper on the window where he had hastily written, "Guy in your car." I turned back around and noticed that my passenger rear door was opened a crack, which it had definitely not been on the drive from work. I booked it inside the station, and once I was there, the clerk locked the door and told me to get down. He had his eyes on my car and had a gun in his hand. I squatted down behind the counter and watched the security cameras as a tall guy in sweatpants and a windbreaker nudged my back door open, slid out quickly and jogged away into the night. I started freaking out. Turns out the clerk had noticed the guy hanging around the side of the building on the monitors. And as soon as I pulled in, he made a beeline for my car. He crouched down and opened the door, and slid himself inside as I was swiping my card, being careful not to close the door all the way behind him, so that I wouldn't hear anything. The clerk had noticed all of this on the camera, and immediately called the cops, who arrived a few minutes later. They searched the area and my car, but were not able to locate the guy, or anything that would lead back to him. The gas station clerk probably saved my life, because who knows what would have happened if I had driven off with that stranger in the back seat. I think the lesson here is obvious. It's not enough to be cautious, you have to stay alert as well. Be suspicious but not stupid. And always listen to your mom. I was 26 when this happened. I was working at a small-town grocery store as the early morning baker, with a shift starting at 5 a.m. There wasn't an overnight crew at the store, so I was one of the only ones who was there that early in the morning, except for the store owner who started at the same time as me. On this particular day, I didn't have the key to the store because I shared it with the other baker, who covered for me on my days off. I wasn't able to get the key before my shift started, as I had off the previous day. It wasn't a big deal though, as I would be able to get into the store when the owner arrived. I've always been a very punctual person, and would always arrive 10 to 15 minutes before my starting time. I lived 15 minutes away in another town, but I like to give myself a good 30 minutes to get there, to account for any possible car troubles or road closures, and maybe I'll stop off and get coffee, etc. If I didn't have my key, I would sit outside the front of the store and wait for the owner to arrive to let me in. On this morning, I arrived 15 minutes early, parked, grabbed my belongings, and started making my way towards the store. The owner never arrived early. He was always there at 5 a.m. sharp, so I expected to wait the full 15 minutes. I always brought a book to pass the time. I couldn't browse through social media on my phone, since there was very poor reception in this small town in the middle of nowhere. I always parked in the back far left corner of the parking lot, so it was a bit of a ways to get to the building. I was about halfway through the parking lot, and that's when I stopped and looked behind me to the main road, where I saw a very large truck coming down it. The truck suddenly stopped dead in the middle of the road. There was no stop signs or traffic lights, so there was no justifiable reason that this truck would stop, especially at 4:45 in the morning. I was caught off guard by the situation, and was just standing there, looking at the truck. I was visible in the dark because I was illuminated by the light of a nearby lamppost. The truck flew into motion and made a sharp turn into the parking lot towards me, and that's when I started sprinting towards the store. I should pause here and give a little context about the structure of the store. It was a multi-business plaza, with the grocery store being on the far right and some other businesses to the left. There's a little walkway between them that leads behind the building, where there is an additional parking lot, a few dumpsters, and a tree line of a nearby forest beyond that. I remembered that I didn't have the key to enter the store. The truck was about halfway through the parking lot, gunning right towards me. When I finally reached the front of the store, I kept running past the door and down the walkway that led between the buildings. As I entered the walkway, I looked back to see the truck turning around and driving around the store, making its way to the back of the building. When it was driving around the store, the truck wasn't visible, and I quickly ducked down behind some bushes that were planted right up against a pillar. Shortly after, I heard the truck pull up behind the store and idle there for a few minutes. I stayed hidden, looking for something that I could use to defend myself just in case. I settled for holding my car keys between my fingers to use as a makeshift weapon. My mind was racing, trying to wrap my head around what was happening, trying to devise a plan to get out of the situation, when I heard a door slam. Whoever was in the truck had gotten out. I didn't want to peek out from my hiding spot, possibly giving away my position. Luckily, the bush was big enough that they wouldn't be able to spot me. I just had to be quiet, so I sat as still as I could. I heard footsteps walking towards me. I was hoping this person would assume that I went into one of the businesses and would just leave. I held my breath. I was sure that at any second they would find me and do God knows what to me. This is the point where I thought about my phone. I knew I didn't have good cell phone reception in this town, and I didn't think it was worth making noise to search through my bag for it anyways. My hands were gripping my car keys. My knuckles were turning white. My body was trembling. My legs were aching underneath me. But I didn't want to readjust to make the bushes rustle. Whoever this was now walking between the buildings. They passed by the bushes I was hiding in and headed to the front. They stood there silently, looking for me. They didn't say a word. There was nothing but the sounds of their footsteps. They walked past my hiding spot again, back towards their truck. To my relief, I heard the slamming of their truck door as they climbed back in. I then heard the rumble of the engine as it accelerated slowly back around to the front parking lot. I could hear the loud engine of the truck idling in front of the store over the next few minutes, before peeling out of the parking lot and down the road. After the truck's engine was no longer audible, I abandoned my hiding spot and ran towards my car, got in, and locked the doors. I turned on my car, just in case the truck came back. I sat there and listened, waiting for the rumbling of the truck's engine to come back, but thankfully, it never did. This happened to me in the summer of 2008. At the time, I was 18 and staying with my mother until college started again. She had moved to this area after I started college the year before, so I didn't know the area that well. This is important for the story. My mother often traveled for work, so most days I was on my own. Every week I would stop for a slice of pizza at the shop that was near the house. After a few weeks, an employee of the pizza shop struck up a conversation, asking questions like, do I live close, how old was I, what school I went to, etc., and ultimately asked me out to go dancing. I don't remember exactly how old he was, but he was definitely older than 21, but younger than 40. Despite only having formally met this guy that day, I stupidly accepted because I was bored. I had been fairly sheltered my whole life, and was extremely shy, and had never been asked out in such a way. I honestly thought that I was rebelling in some way by agreeing to go out with him. I gushed about it to my best friend, who lived in the next county over. She was excited for me. I had already planned to visit her the following day and promised her all the juicy details. I agreed to meet the guy that night outside of the pizza shop. He offered to pick me up from my house, but I said no simply because I didn't want to have to explain to my mother who he was if he ever decided to show up unannounced. At the time, I felt that she asked too many questions, but in reality, she didn't ask enough. And should have just met him at whatever club we were supposed to go to, which he never named. But again, I was a dumb 18-year-old. And I thought this guy was such a gentleman for insisting that he drives me. The second I met up with him, things started going south. I parked my car and got out to greet him. To my surprise, he was still in his work clothes. He claimed that he was just getting off work, which he didn't mention would be the case earlier when we set the time. I thought it was weird, but I still got in his car. He told me after I was already in his car and we were up the road that he needed to go home first and clean up. I was immediately on edge, but I didn't want to anger him or ruin the night before it started, so I reluctantly said okay. We got to his apartment, and I hesitated to enter, but he ever so gently put his hand on my back and steered me inside. He turned on the TV for me and told me to get comfortable. I said I was fine and shuffled my feet a bit, clutching my purse and looking around the room, mentally recounting the path to the exit. I was relieved when he went into his room and closed the door. I then heard the sounds of running water. I relaxed a little and sat on the couch to watch TV. Not long after that, he came out of his room. My mind has blocked the details of this part. He was either completely naked or had a towel loosely covering his privates, but he was definitely not clothed. I thought about running, but I didn't know where I was, and this was before Uber. He tried talking to me about something mundane, as if he wasn't standing nude in front of a girl he had just met that day. I answered, but kept my eyes firmly on the TV. He finally gave up and went back into his room and got dressed. He came back out and said that he was ready to go. I was super glad to get out of there. I thought we were going dancing, and a lively atmosphere with more people around would have made me feel better. But when we got back to his car, he drove a ways until we came to a shopping plaza with stores and restaurants. In my head I thought, there's no way that there's a dance club here. And there wasn't. When I said to him, I thought we were going dancing, he said, we are, but we should eat first, don't you think? So again, while internally screaming to get out of there, I agreed to go eat with him because now I was even further from home, and he was my ride back to my car. So in my mind, it would be best not to anger or insult him in any way. I also reasoned to myself that I would be okay in a restaurant anyway, because there would be witnesses there if he tried anything. I shudder, thinking about how naive I was back then. We get seated and order food. He then starts telling me about how I should try out the margaritas at this place. I remind him that I'm only 18, but he says that it's no big deal. He calls over the waiter before I could argue further and orders a margarita for me. Just one for me and nothing for himself. The waiter asked me my age, and I thought that this was my way out. I quickly and loudly say that I'm 18, but the waiter frowns, looks at the guy who made a gesture that I didn't fully catch, and then the waiter turns back to me and says, you're not old enough, and we're really not supposed to, but I'll make an exception this time. I was shocked. After the waiter walked off, the guy I was with chastised me in a whisper, saying that I should have lied about my age. I asked him if he was serious, half annoyed, half exasperated, and said that I barely passed for 18, and that no one would believe that I was any older than that. He shrugged, and I nibbled my food, bitterly cursing myself for getting into this mess, and praying that I would make it home alive. The margarita came out, and it was massive. I tried to get away with not drinking any, but the guy noticed and pushed it closer to me. I was desperate to keep my wits about me, but I didn't know how he would react if I flatly refused to drink it, so I took a few sips. Whoever made the drink was heavy-handed, to say the least. I was a complete lightweight, and was only about 110 pounds on top of that, so those few sips I took got me very buzzed. I had been at college for a year by this time, and learned some basics about drinking. Yeah, most of us drank underage, sue me. I tried to shovel more food in to soak up some of the alcohol, but as small as I was already getting full, and didn't manage to get enough in to sober up. Thinking back, the guy watched me like a hawk, every sip, every bite. I kept my head down, and could barely look at him in the eye. My vision was slightly blurry now, and I'm sure my eyes drooped a little too. I remember telling him that I no longer wanted to go dancing, and just wanted to go home. Before I knew it, he settled the check, and we were out the door and back in his car. He asked me if I was drunk with a chuckle, and I told him, no, not even close, trying my best not to slur my words, but I have no idea what I looked like. I must have looked like prey, because it was at this point that he made his move. He started saying how beautiful I looked, and how good I smelled. He put his hand on my thigh and rubbed it. I tried moving away from his hands, but his car was small, and he could reach me easily. I had a lot of thoughts in that car in those short moments. I thought about tucking and rolling out. I remembered that there was a knife in my car, and wished that I had thought to put it in my purse. I thought about dialing 911, and it was that thought that snapped me out of my stupor. It was like all this time, I had forgotten that I had a phone. I started looking for street signs and buildings that I might be able to relay to a dispatcher. It didn't take long before I realized that he was driving in circles. This made me angry. I thought he was taking me back to my car all this time. The word kidnapped flashed in my head, and my fight or flight took over. I abandoned all politeness and asked him why we were going in circles. He ignored my question and said that I should hang out with him at his place to sober up. He started driving faster, and I told him that I didn't want to go back to his place. I wanted to go home and to sleep. He tried to convince me that I could do that at his place, that we could cuddle up and watch a movie. The car stopped, and to my horror, we were outside of his apartment. I turned to him and sternly said to his face, "You're going to take me back to my car right now, or I'm calling the police, and keep your hands to yourself. I have a knife in my bag if you try anything else." I was shaking all over, fighting back tears, and clearly bluffing about the knife. He didn't speak or move, possibly deciding if he wanted to call my bluff or just get rid of me. He donned a noticeable scowl on his face. He seemed to decide on the latter option and started driving again. I kept my eyes on every street sign until I recognized where we were. The car barely came to a stop when we finally got to the pizza shop. Before I jumped out and ran to my car, but stupid me didn't have my keys out and ready. I fumbled them, dropped them, bent to pick them up, and opened my door. Before I could close it, he was there holding it open and refusing to let go. He was far stronger than me. He said that I couldn't leave without giving him a kiss goodbye. I briefly considered running him over, but decided against it. I gave the quickest peck on the cheek, pushed him back, and slammed and locked my door. He actually tried to reopen it. I turned on the car, but hesitated. I was still buzzed, and I knew that I shouldn't drive, but if I waited, this guy would follow me home. I was only 4 blocks away, and it was past 11 a.m., so I took the chance and gunned it out of there. He wasn't back in his car yet, so I had a head start. I checked my rearview mirror the whole way, and drove around the block by the house, and parked in an alley to make sure that I wasn't followed. I pretty much spent the rest of that night crying. He had my number, and tried calling and texting me several times, but I didn't answer. The next day I went to my friend's house and told her everything. I was distraught and scared. The calls from him continued. This was pre-smartphone days, and I had no idea how to block his number. Eventually my friend's older sister grabbed my phone, mustered up her most ghetto voice possible, and yelled into the phone about what was going to happen to him if he didn't stop calling. The call stopped immediately after that. I never told my mother about what happened, and I never went to the police, but I also never saw that guy again. I only ever went back to that pizza place once after that, and my friend was with me. I don't remember whose idea it was to go. Maybe I wanted to show her who the guy was, or maybe we just wanted a cheap pizza. Fortunately, he wasn't in the front. We ordered the pizza, and I made the comment that he might spit in our food if he knew it was me. A rather shocked guy behind the counter asked why I would say that, and I gave him a brief rundown of what happened. He walked in the back and came back out a short while later saying that no one would spit in our food, and assured me that that guy would never bother me ever again.
There's always a reason to be afraid.
This is my dad's story from about 35 years ago. I will tell it from his perspective exactly as it was told to me. I grew up on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon, and when I was younger, my friends and I went camping pretty often, as it was something that we could do and drink and have fun being underage. When I was about 18, my friends and I decided one weekend to go camping near a lake called Small Fry. It's not too far from Portland, but far enough to get away. It was a pretty last-minute plan, so we didn't bring much other than some blankets and a case of beer my older brother bought for us. After school on Friday, we headed out, and once we got out there, we found a cleared-out area that we could easily park our car in. At first, we made a small fire and drank a few beers, but we quickly got bored and decided that we would go out for a midnight swim. The area we parked in wasn't near an actual trail to the lake, but it was only about a half a mile away, and we knew what direction to go in. My 3 friends and I were pretty buzzed, as we were somewhat lightweights at that age. We decided to head out into the forest towards where the lake was. Now this was back in the 80s, so we didn't have cell phones with maps on them to double check. We trudged through the forest, completely sure that we were going the right way. I think it was about 15 minutes since we left the campsite, and suddenly the air around us changed. It was a warm, nearly summer night, and it was probably around 70 degrees. But as we kept walking, it felt like it was getting colder and colder. Suddenly I felt all the hairs on my body stick straight up, and the 4 of us all quickly turned around and ran back towards the campsite. We didn't talk, not even a word muttered to each other about turning back around. I've never ran that fast in my life. As bad as it sounds, my mindset in that moment was just I couldn't be the slowest, as I didn't want it to be my life ending that night. I can't explain why, but at that exact moment, we were all in that fight or flight mode, and we decided to run for our lives. I remember feeling as if there was a presence behind me. Not even a person, but just something. Something that wanted to harm us. We bolted back to the car, quickly unlocked it, and we all hopped in and drove straight home. We left the fire burning at the campsite, and all the clothes and blankets we brought with us were left as well. The car ride home was completely silent. We got back to my house. My friends got in their cars and left, and we never talked about that night since. A few weeks later, it was finally summer. My family went on yearly camping trips with a few other families that were close to us. One night, as a group of about 20 of us were sitting by the fire telling stories and just talking about life in general, someone from one of the other families brought up a weird hiking story they had recently experienced. He explained that he and his wife, along with a few of their friends, decided to go hiking on a Saturday. When they arrived, they were surprised to see that no one else was out there. It was a known hiking spot, so they figured that it would be pretty busy on a Saturday. The group of them hiked up the trail, and they soon got to the top of a cliff that overlooked a lake. When they got to the top, he felt as if he had no voice. The group of them quickly turned around and began to hike back down, walking much faster than normal. They didn't talk. They all just apparently decided that they did not want to stay, not even to take in the view. They had brought lunches with them, and all talked about taking some pictures too. Instead, they all hurried down the trail, not talking to each other at all. They all just had this gut feeling that they had to get out of there. None of them spoke to each other on the way home, and no one brought it up since. I asked where this hike took place, never mentioning that I had a similar experience. The man said that this all took place on Small Fry Lake. That honestly scared the crap out of me, as I had just had that same experience. I did not want to say anything though, as my parents were visibly concerned, and I didn't want them trying to tell me that I couldn't go camping in that area again. This might not be the scariest story, but I'm curious to know if anyone else has been to this area and had a similar experience. When I was talking to this man and his wife, they both said that they had this gut feeling that they were living the last few seconds of their lives. The man said he started to see his life flashing before his eyes as he hurried down the hill. I don't know what's going on at that lake and what made us all feel that way, but there's definitely something not right about that place. I've never believed in the supernatural, but after this, I feel as though that is the only explanation. All I know is that I will never be going back there, ever again. I grew up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. My family moved up there when I was about 6 months old. I was originally born in a small town called Mount Clemens. It's the same town that Dean Cain from The Adventures of Lewis and Clark was born in. I suppose that's my biggest claim to fame. Michigan is quite a unique state, the way it's positioned on the northern border of the US and the southern border of Canada. Those of us that are born in Michigan usually stay here, and no one ever travels to my neck of the woods. There's no real way to just pass by, and we're landlocked by the Great Lakes, if that makes sense. With the exception of the large cities, the state is mostly covered by woodlands. I have a few strange experiences living in the Upper Peninsula, but none stranger than the one I'm about to tell. We lived on top of a hill, about a 30-minute drive to the nearest town. Our next-door neighbors were a good 10 miles away. It was quiet. Few, if any, vehicles ever came by the house. I developed a strange fear of vehicles coming up the hill. It seemed like you could hear them for miles. I mean, of course, there were others who lived on our road, but this wasn't a place for outsiders to take shortcuts. We didn't even have names for our roads. They were all designated by numbers. When I got older, I wasn't too excited or afraid when vehicles would pass by. During the day, I knew most of the cars and trucks that our distant neighbors drove. When night came, well, that was a different story. I could see the headlights cutting through my bedroom window and light up my walls like some kind of ominous paint. It's a hard feeling to describe, but in my young mind, I felt that no one had any business driving down such a remote road at any point after dark. At the time, I was about 13, The year was 1996. Our family, amazingly, had just acquired internet. Anyone that's in their mid to late 30s knows how insane this time was. For whatever reason, at this time, my dad installed a glass sliding door on the wall near where the computer was. The computer used to be the hub of our home at the time, unlike nowadays where every family member has their own computer, plus a billion other gadgets in their pocket. So having the sliding door open up to the scenery of the countryside from the computer desk was actually pretty nice. I appreciated it for about 2 days, before one of the strangest things I've ever seen occurred. I was up late on a Saturday night on the computer, like usual. In those days, I was probably messing around in the Yahoo chat rooms, or maybe playing Myst. Then I heard it. I mostly felt it at first. The low rumbling of a truck engine, creeping slowly down the main road. The truck passed by our house, and then stopped. The long-forgotten fear I mentioned earlier came roaring back like a freight train. Nothing good would come from a suspicious truck driving down our road at 1 o'clock in the morning. What I saw next has burned itself inside my head. I can still recall it as clear as day. The truck screeched to a stop. A man flung open the passenger side door and quickly hustled over to the driver's side. This was all taking place too far away for me to give a really good physical description, but I could tell the passenger was much larger than the driver. He wore some kind of puffy vest, jeans, and one of those trucker-style caps. He grabbed the driver and dragged him out of the truck, then slammed him against the tailgate. He seemed to be shouting orders at the driver, motioning him to open the tailgate. When he did, I saw the driver turn to the bigger guy, as if he was hesitating out of fear. Even at a distance, I could see this clearly. The driver was unnerved, and his partner forcefully handed him a shovel. The passenger then pointed to a spot on the side of the road behind the truck. The panicked driver began to frantically dig where the passenger had pointed to. He dug for about 3 to 4 minutes, paused, then looked at the driver, and the two exchanged some words that I couldn't quite make out. The passenger then dragged something out of the bed of the truck. I can only describe it as a closed sleeping bag, with a body still inside. The passenger walked over to the shallow grave and tossed it in. The two men then made a poor attempt of covering the hole before they sped off. You may be asking, well, did you go out and see what they buried? And the answer is surely what you would expect. Of course I did. And that's the creepiest part of all. When I went out to the road the next morning, the hole was empty. I knew what I saw. There was even the tire tracks from the night before. But whatever they threw into that hole was gone. I looked to the opposite side of the burial and was horrified to see footprints in the dirt leading straight into the forest. I had no idea what to make of it. I've repressed this memory for so long and just wanted to pretend that it never happened. Aside from a few close friends, I've never told anyone about this. I believe that bag they threw into the ground had someone in it, and they thought that person was dead. However, based on what I saw the next morning, they were wrong. You can chalk this all up to teenage imagination if you like, but I stand by what I say. There are some things in this world that you'll never be able to explain, and even if you could, chances are you wouldn't care much for the answer. My dad owned a small house for a brief amount of time. This particular house was not one that he lived in. He bought the place to renovate and resell it for profit. This house was on a dead-end street in the woods. It was a very private location, but the road had a history of people dumping things off and abandoning stolen vehicles. There was only 2 houses on the street. This house was often used by drifters. A neighbor told us that it was a drug house for a long time. A few months after my dad bought the house, he called me to ask if I would meet him there to help him unload some materials. I arrived about 10 minutes before he did, and noticed that there was a car in front of the house. I decided to go investigate to see if there was anyone in the car. The car had a license plate on it, and I saw clothing piled up in the back seat. As I was walking around the car, I started to have this uneasy feeling that I wasn't alone. I then heard someone moving around in the woods near the house. I went and stood at the edge of the woods for several minutes, watching and waiting. My dad arrived a few minutes later with his trailer. He got out of his truck and walked over to the car. I told him I had a feeling that whoever owned it was still close by, and that I heard someone walking around in the woods before he got there. He looked over to the car, just like I did. Then we both decided to walk through the woods to see if we can find someone. As we were walking, I got the feeling that we were being watched by someone. I remember telling my dad how creepy it would be if we actually found a dead body. He said that he had the same strange feeling that we weren't alone. The pathway we were on came to a dead end, so we turned back. The car was still there when we returned. We decided to call the police to report the abandoned car. After getting off the phone with the police, we went inside the house to check on a few things. We were only inside for a couple of minutes. When we came back out, we noticed that the car was gone. Someone had to have been watching us while we were investigating, and decided to immediately take off when we went inside. The police never showed up that night, and we eventually left. Several weeks later, a dead body was discovered in the forest by the house. The person who found the body was a lady who was hiking through the area. There was a neighbor who told her about the body before she found it, but the neighbor had a reputation of being a mentally unstable drunk, and no one took him seriously. That was the rumor anyway. After the body was found, the police came out to do a report. One of the detectives took a statement from my dad. My dad said the detective acted strange and uninterested. I refused to believe that it was just a coincidence that we saw a parked car in that area, not long before that body was discovered. As far as my dad knows, they never followed up with the neighbor after the body was found. He had a conversation with him months after this happened, right before he sold off the house. The story gets even stranger. The hiker who found the corpse stated it looked like it hadn't been there for very long, meaning that it wasn't a rotting heap. She also noted that the head and hands had been removed. The police would later report that the body had been there for years. Something tells me that that isn't true. If the body had really been there for years, it would have been nothing but a pile of bones and rot. It just doesn't add up. It also makes me wonder what could have happened to me or my dad if we had found the driver of the car that day. This happened 2 years ago, and it still puts me on edge thinking about it. My husband, myself, and our then 2-year-old daughter moved to Tennessee to get a fresh start on life. We were all exhausted after a long drive and just wanted to get out the mattresses. My parents, who lived in Tennessee already, were helping us unload. Naturally, all the neighbors in our apartment complex came out and said hi. That's when we met Ben. Right away, I got creepy vibes off of him. Our daughter, who to this day is way too friendly to strangers, hid behind my husband and visibly cringed. We made small talk, but mainly paid more attention to unloading our stuff than chatting with our new neighbors. My dad later told me that at one point, he came back to the truck and saw Ben staring at our daughter. My dad called him out, and when Ben denied it, my husband eventually told him to go fuck off. Later that night, me and my husband were still going through our stuff. Our daughter was staying the night at my parents' house. It was about 10:30 p.m. when we heard a knock at the door. Thinking that it was the pizza that I ordered, my husband opened the door, and there stood Ben. He asked us if we needed any help. Him showing up at our door so late at night, even for a friendly neighbor, was just creepy. Before we could tell him to get lost, he demanded a cigarette. Not only was he a total weirdo, but now he was just being plain rude. Neither of us smoked, and when we told him, he got a bit pissed. He started yelling and screaming at my husband, and began pounding on the wall. This guy was unhinged. Thankfully, our landlord lived across the way from us at the time, and came out to tell him off. As Ben sauntered away, our landlord explained to us that Ben is the resident pest, and suffered from mental issues, but overall, was harmless as long as he took his meds. Yeah, because that's exactly what you want to hear on your first night in a new place. After that, life kind of fell into place, and we settled in without any further disruptions. We had crazy schedules and would sometimes work graveyard shifts. I would get home around midnight and would see Ben standing outside the apartment buildings. He would always seem to be staring at me. I would just ignore him, mainly because I was just too tired and wanted to get to bed. He would always ask me for cigarettes, and I kept telling him that I didn't smoke. My husband said that he did the same thing to him. We would change up our work times just to throw Ben off a little, and at first, it worked, but Ben started to pester us during the day. On our days off, we would take our kid to the park or the mountains. One time, Ben asked to come with us, said that he was great with kids, and that we could trust him alone with our daughter. I really should have just let my husband deck him in the face right then and there. When we came back, he was sitting in our parking spot, said that he was making sure no one parked in it. He then tried to hug our daughter, and she screamed and clung on to me for dear life. I took her into the house while my husband finally snapped and really gave the guy an earful, telling him just to leave us the fuck alone. We told the landlord, but they played the whole mental issues card. And look, I get it. Mental illness is never fun to deal with, but he was constantly harassing and terrifying my daughter, and we have a duty to protect our family. It got to the point where my daughter didn't want to go outside because the bad man would be out there and stare at her. We threatened to cut our lease if something wasn't done about it. I began talking to my other neighbors, and everyone seemed to have the same type of experience. One of my neighbors told me that he and another neighbor saw Ben staring at some of the young girls wearing bathing suits and short shorts by the community pool, and they chased him off. They reported this to the landlord, but nothing was ever done. After about a month, things had quieted down. Ben wasn't spotted outside anymore. In fact, no one really saw him. We figured he moved away or something. Good riddance. We were thinking about moving in with my folks, while we saved up the money for a real house. One night, I came home from work early. My husband was out of town because of work, and my parents had taken our daughter to visit some family. I decided to play Saints Row 4 and relax after working an 11-hour shift. I was deep into the game when someone knocked on the door. It was about 10 p.m. at this point. If anyone was coming over that late, they would have called or texted first. I got up to see who it was. Before I got to the door, the knob began to shake violently. Then I heard Ben screaming,
Let me in! Open this goddamn door!
The heavy knocking turned into him slamming his shoulder against the door. He was screaming like a deranged madman. I grabbed my phone, the sharpest knife that we had from the kitchen, and hid in the closet. Cliché, I know, but if he managed to get in, there would at least be some distance between us. I called 911, and they said that my other neighbors had called in as well. It was only after I heard the sirens stop and voices yelling outside that I felt safe to come out. I opened my door and saw a cop pinning Ben face down on the ground. The landlord was screaming at the cop to let him go, and he even shoved him. Both of them ended up being arrested. I gave my report, and each one of my neighbors backed up everything I said, and even added in their own experiences. My sweet church lady neighbor called my husband and parents to let them know what was going on, and she even let me stay with her and her family for the night. But after what happened, I couldn't sleep at all. I kept thinking that at any moment I would hear Ben's deranged screaming and pounding from outside. It turns out Ben was a registered sex offender. Rumor has it that the landlord was aware of it, but willingly overlooked it as Ben's family would slip him extra money as long as he was allowed to stay there. That's why nothing was ever done about his behavior. Makes me sick. Ben really did take meds, but had not been on any of them for the past few months. He tried to tell the cops that our daughter was his and that we kidnapped her, and that I was having an affair with him. Crazy, right? Last thing I heard, Ben was placed in some institution. I'm not sure if it was prison or a psych ward. The landlord was fired and pretty much chased out of town. Good riddance. We were offered 3 months rent-free for our trouble, but that was ultimately our breaking point. We sold off most of our belongings and moved in with my parents. I'm happy to say that we have a house now, and our daughter is not afraid to go outside anymore. And yes, we checked all of our neighbors for red dots. My mother was 14 in 1986 when this happened. She lived in China at the time with her parents and younger brother. It was deep into winter when this occurred, and the temperature dropped into the negatives. Snow was falling in thick layers onto the ground. It was around 10 p.m. when my mother finished up her classes, and by then it was dark. Bear in mind, in China it's normal for young students to walk home alone without a parent or guardian. About 10 minutes after getting off the bus, she began walking through this old marketplace to get to her apartment. The marketplace was completely quiet and deserted at this time of night. There was also no lampposts around, so it was hard for my mom to properly see where she was going. But she had traveled this route several times before, so she was familiar and knew her way back home. My mother had this feeling that someone was lurking in the darkness of the marketplace. She tried to shrug it off, but the apprehension persisted. She continued to hear her feet crunching on the white snow. But suddenly, she stopped, and as she did, she could hear a second pair of feet crunching the snow behind her. My mom panicked, but she continued forward and pretended that she hadn't heard anything. She thought it might have been another student making their way back to their living quarters. This thought made sense, but it didn't stop her from walking faster. As she began to pick up her pace, the crunching snow behind her also began to speed up. My mother couldn't handle the fear any longer and started running, but the thick snow made it difficult for her to run away quickly. She also gave a quick look behind her. She was greeted by the silhouette of a tall man only a few meters away and closing in. The man did not appear to be wearing a coat, despite the freezing temperature. The lack of lampposts made it difficult for my mom to make out anything else. However, that's not what scared my mom the most. She was eventually chased into an area that was lit by a dim light mounted to the side of a merchant stall. When she looked back, she was able to see that her pursuer was carrying a large plank in his hand. Now petrified, she continued to run and refused to look back again. Suddenly, she saw the light of a lamppost that was situated on a small street. Luckily that night, there happened to be a young couple walking towards her. With her last ounce of energy, my mom ran to them and collapsed. My mom was in hysterics when they asked her what was wrong. She explained to them what happened, but by then, the stranger had vanished. The couple that she ran into was living in the same apartment block as her and was familiar with her father. They accompanied her back home, and they told my grandfather where they found her. After the couple left, my mom couldn't stop crying out of shock and fear. From then on, my grandfather would meet my mom at the bus stop where she got off at, and they would walk home together. My mom never found out who her assailant was, and thankfully, she never had another encounter with him again. In the summer of 2017, my boyfriend and I were visiting my family before my brother started middle school that August. My parents were watching TV in their room. I was working on some schoolwork, and my brother and boyfriend were playing a video game in the next room. They were gracious enough to keep the volume down so that I could concentrate on my essay. At around 8:30 p.m., I suddenly remembered that I needed to put some gas in my car. Finishing the last paragraph of my essay, I called my parents to let them know that I would be gone for a few minutes, but that I was coming straight back. The gas station was about 10 minutes from my house, so I would have been back in about 20 minutes or so. I grabbed my keys, kissed my boyfriend goodbye, and left without another word. After 10 minutes of driving, I arrived at the gas station and pulled up to the nearest pump. As I started pumping gas into my car, an old beat-up pickup truck appeared in the corner of my eye. I turned my head to look and noticed two dark figures just sitting there. I couldn't make out any distinguishing features, but they seemed to be talking while checking out the place. I brushed it off and finished filling my tank. Before I got back into my car, I decided to run into the building to grab some snacks for my boyfriend. I then walked inside and quickly picked out some items. Just as I was done making my purchase, two men wearing jeans with black hoodies burst into the store, guns drawn. Both of them appeared to be in their mid-20s and fairly built.
"Everybody get on the ground!"
the first man shouted. The cashier and everyone else in the store immediately obeyed his orders. There was a few panicked whispers until one of the men shouted at them to shut up. I felt my heart pick up its pace, and my blood ran cold. These men were about to rob this place, and possibly shoot up the customers or the cashier. I prayed silently to myself that no one would be killed or seriously injured. One of the men grabbed my hair.
"You, stand!"
he commanded. Fearing for my life, I did as he ordered. Almost immediately, I felt an arm snake around my wrist and take hold. I would have elbowed him, stomped his foot, or attempted to punch his face, but I was so paralyzed in fear to think or do anything. The worst part, I felt a gun aiming at the back of my head. I tried squirming away from the man's grip, but he just held me tighter and hissed at me.
"Stay still, sweetheart, and no one gets hurt."
The other man shouted at the cashier.
"Hand over the cash, or you're gonna be scraping this bitch's brains off the wall."
I had no connection with the cashier in any way, except for just being a customer at the store, but I could tell from the look in his eyes that he wanted to protect me in any way he could. He was an older guy, possibly in his 60s, with glasses on his face. I knew that he had no choice but to comply with their demands. He hastily unlocked the register. As he was handing over the cash, I felt the barrel of the gun pressed against the side of my head, and I nearly started to freak out. I restrained myself and just started to tear up a little. My throat burned from holding it back, all for the sake of keeping myself alive for as long as possible. Once every last dollar bill was in the man's hands, sirens blared from outside. The man then stuffed the money into a backpack, then punched out the cashier. I was then thrown to the side, my stomach and arm hitting the edge of the counter before I fell onto the floor. As soon as the two men ran outside, they were surrounded by police. Within seconds, they were tackled to the ground and handcuffed. I was still catching my breath, but I was more concerned about the cashier. I pulled myself up and peeked over the counter. For the most part, he seemed okay, although I could see his right eye was turning black. His glasses laid broken on the floor.
"Are you all right, sir?"
I weakly asked him, my stomach still hurting.
"I'm a little blind at the moment, but I'll be okay,"
he responded.
"Is everyone all right?"
a familiar voice asked. One of the cops, who was also very good friends with my father, had entered the store.
"Just us two might need some attention,"
I said. The officer turned towards us. He immediately recognized me and asked if I was okay. The cashier and I told him everything, as other cops eventually came in and questioned the other customers. It turns out that a customer had sneaked into the bathroom and called 911 without the robbers noticing. Once the questioning had finished, I just couldn't hold it in anymore. I burst into tears, not because I was in pain, but because I had just endured the scariest moment of my life. I just wanted to get home and put an ice pack on my stomach. The cashier was rushed out of the store on a stretcher.
"Do you need any medical attention?"
the officer asked. I shook my head and cried,
"I just want to go home."
As I walked out of the store, I noticed a few cops investigating the truck I had seen earlier. And then it clicked in my head. That vehicle belonged to the two men. They had been scoping out the place, waiting for the right time to strike. And I was pretty sure that I was the first person they saw to use as bait. A police car followed me home that night. Eventually we came to my neighborhood. My mom rushed out of the house and embraced me in her arms. She kept asking me what happened, but I could hardly speak because I was crying so much. Once I was inside, my boyfriend saw me and wrapped me around his arms and held me until I calmed down. My dad's friend came in shortly after and explained what happened at the gas station. After the cops left, I was lying on the couch watching TV with an ice pack on my stomach. My brother came in and asked me what happened, but I knew that he had to go to bed soon, so I promised I would tell him in the morning. I was still pretty shaken up about what happened, and I didn't want to scare him. I then made a promise to myself that I would never go certain places at night ever again. A couple of years ago, there was reports of a woman being attacked in my area. This was shocking because my community had recently gotten rid of a bunch of drug dealers who operated in my neighborhood, and the gang activity connected to that had died down significantly. We were all looking forward to living in a clean, peaceful neighborhood for a while. No such luck. I lived in an apartment building and was about 17 at the time. The attack on the woman was brutal. She had been sexually assaulted and beaten unconscious. Over the next few months, this happened to at least a dozen other women. Not much details were released to the press. I'm guessing the victims were too frightened to speak publicly about their encounters. Luckily, they all survived. However, none of them were able to give an accurate description of the perpetrator. as the attacker would usually sneak up from behind in the dark. All of them were attacked while they were walking home from work. This meant that the assailant most likely watched these women and became familiar with their routines before making his move. Everyone was on edge. You could even see it in the streets. Husbands and fathers would hurry their families indoors as soon as the sun started going down. Children were not allowed to play outside after dark, and it was winter at the time, so the sun went down rather early. As soon as it got dark, the streets were dead. One day, my grandmother came to visit us. My mother had come down with a bad case of the flu. My grandmother spent the day at our place, and I guess we all chatted for a bit too long. By the time she was ready to leave, it was completely dark outside, and it felt wrong to let my grandmother go out on her own. My mom obviously wasn't feeling well, so I, being the stupid brave teenager I was, said that I would walk with Grandma to the bus stop. I was 5'2", not the ideal bodyguard. But come on, would any of you let your grandma walk the streets alone with a serial rapist on the loose? We got to the station just fine, and I waved my grandma goodbye as her bus departed. There was a crowd of people who had gotten off the bus before my grandma boarded. After the bus was out of sight, I suddenly felt like I was being watched, and I turned around quickly. As I did, I looked straight at a dark figure who was standing under a lamppost that was just down the street from the bus stop. I froze, shocked. The recent attacks had been in the back of my mind all night, and here I was, practically by myself, staring down a dark, creepy figure that was standing under a streetlight. I suddenly broke into a run and caught up with the small crowd of people that had gotten off the bus. I ran through the crowd and sprinted home, looking behind me every 5 seconds. I was in hysterics by the time I reached my apartment building. Now, hear me out, guys. I know that nothing technically happened to me, but I was scared out of my wits. So I figured that I would call the non-emergency number for the police, just to let them know that there was a suspicious man standing outside the bus stop. Couldn't hurt, right? A while after I reported it, an officer called me back. I gave them my number when I made my initial report. They were really looking for this guy, so they made it a point to follow up on any possible leads. They got the man's full description by reversing the footage from the bus stop's security camera, and his appearance was an exact match to what one of the victims had described. A couple of days later, I learned from a local news report that they arrested someone in connection with the attacks. On the night before I saw him at the bus stop, he had apparently almost killed a female beat cop who was patrolling around an area where one of the attacks had taken place. He attacked her from behind and nearly beat her to death with a crowbar. Luckily, the lady survived. But I think that was one of the reasons why the police were so hell-bent on catching him. I've learned one more thing since his arrest. He had apparently been there at the bus stop to look out for more potential victims. Thank God I called the police that night on purely a hunch. I like to think that I contributed to the arrest of a very dangerous man. Hopefully he spends the rest of his days behind bars, where animals like him belong. This happened when I was 9 years old in 1987. I grew up in Townsend, Massachusetts. It's a medium-sized town on the New Hampshire border. My dad worked for a very well-known local plastics company, and my stepmom worked at the Congregational Church. I got dragged along with his wife to church every Sunday, whether I wanted to or not. The one saving grace of going to church with my dad's wife was the opportunity to go on the playground after Sunday school class and the standing offer of cake, which they had almost every Sunday. It was one Sunday in late November. I was dragged to church with my dad's wife. Afterwards, as usual, me and the rest of the kids from class poured into the churchyard to socialize and drop cake everywhere. Now, I don't really remember what prompted me to approach a girl named Abby. She was 2 years younger than me, and a lot more popular. She was somebody that I barely knew, and hardly ever spoke to. But still, something within me told me that I had to tell her something important. So I sought her out on the playground that morning. "Hey, Abby," I started, feeling driven by something I couldn't explain. "You have to grow your fingernails out, so if someone tries to hurt you, you can go right for their eyes." I was dead serious as I said this. She gave me a slightly confused look and said, "Okay, why?" I didn't have an answer to that, so I just kinda shrugged and told her, "Just do it, okay? Trust me." A week later, she, her younger brother, and their mom would be found dead, murdered by a neighborhood psychopath named Daniel LaPlante. He had broken into their home, shot and killed Abby's mother Priscilla, and then drowned Abby and her brother William. He managed to hide from the police for at least 2 days, eventually being captured a half-hour away in the town of Ayer. When he was arrested, the police noticed scratches around his eyes. I cried when I found out that she and her family had been brutally murdered. I finally understood why I had to warn her, but still could not explain how I knew. Regardless, I view it as a failure on my part. I remember being incredibly distraught about it. No 9-year-old should have that kind of burden or guilt. I feel awful about what happened to Abby and her family, and I wish I could have done more to save her life. It took me years to mentally accept what happened. Survivor's guilt is a hell of a thing, but I was just too young to fully understand. My best friend is a social media influencer. Nothing big time, but with a big enough following to get free shit, and has gotten 2 sponsored trips. She works a full-time job, but does the Instagram thing on the side mostly because of the perks. She's not big enough to make a living off this yet. Anyway, this was her first trip. A small boutique hotel from Miami contacted her through Instagram and offered her an all-expenses-paid trip to Miami for Memorial Weekend in 2018, in exchange for her to be in the hotel and take pictures and do a couple of stories. She was told that she could bring a female friend with her, and everything would be covered. This was her first time doing this, so at the time, she really didn't know how it worked. They sent her a bogus contract for her to sign. It stated that she would be responsible for paying for her plane ticket to Miami, and that she would be reimbursed for it later. This was to prevent a no-show, meaning the influencer gets the ticket purchased by the hotel, and the influencer never shows up. It seemed reasonable. She invited me, instead of a female friend, because she was nervous about the whole thing. We figured it wouldn't be a big deal, and worst case scenario, they wouldn't want to pay for my plane ticket, and she said if that was the case she would just cover it for me. We were supposed to be picked up by the hotel at the airport, so the day comes and we arrive in Miami. There's a guy holding up a sign with her last name, and the sign had the hotel logo on it. We were greeted and escorted to a black SUV. Here's where things get weird. As soon as we get in the car, the driver is visibly upset. We thought he was talking to the guy who walked us over, but he was talking to my friend. He had a very thick accent and was wearing dark shades. He was telling my friend that she was not allowed to bring her boyfriend, referring to me, and said that it was supposed to be 2 girls. 2 girls. Hotel told me 2 girls. No 1 girl, 1 guy. 2 girls. He was demanding to see where the other girl was. We were speechless and confused. The guy who walked us to the car looked annoyed. He got in the passenger seat and started arguing with the driver in what sounded like Portuguese. He then turns back to us and asked us where the other girl was. My friend, who's very upset at this point, tells him that there is no other girl, and that she is the influencer from Instagram, and I was just a friend coming with her on the trip. The big guy in the passenger seat gets out, tosses our luggage out of the car, and says something like, "This is some fucking bullshit." He then gets back in the car and they take off. And that was it. We were in shock. Utter and complete shock. My friend immediately emails Melissa, who was the PR person she had been in contact with through email, but she got no response. We decided to take a cab and show up to the hotel. When we got there, that's when everything started to make sense. The hotel had been rebranded and had a completely different name. We showed them the Instagram account, and it was indeed the Instagram account of the old hotel, but not the new one. They claimed to never contact us. Whoever was in charge of the old Instagram account, or whoever got a hold of it, did. Mind you that this was a pretty well-known hotel, and the account had over 10,000 followers. It was real, but upon further inspection we realized that the posts and pictures were really old. My friend felt like an idiot, and ended up breaking down. We called the police and met up with a detective. They investigated who was running the account before, or who had access to it, and nothing ever happened. It's upsetting and scary to know that whoever wanted to abduct my friend, or any other girls by using this old hotel Instagram, knows who my friend is. That account has since been deleted, and we never heard anything from anyone ever again. But to think that my friend could have been kidnapped had she gone with another girl instead of me sends chills down my spine. I've never had the best of luck with guys. I appear to have poor taste when it comes to dating. After separating for good from my kid's father after 5 years, I was ready to just be myself. About 3 months of being a single mother, my neighbor approached me stating that a friend of his, Steve, would like to meet me. It didn't take long before he charmed his way into my life. The first 6 months were amazing, but he began to drink more and more, and each time he would get extremely agitated. He would start fights with random people, and even some of our friends. Slowly, our friends would stop coming around, knowing how Steve got when he drank. This, however, did not stop him from drinking. But now all the anger was aimed at me. It took roughly 6 to 8 months of buildup, from name-calling and shoving to punching and choking. Suddenly, this became a very abusive relationship. One time, I escaped out of the bathroom window. He later found me by beating up a friend of mine until he told him where I was. Steve began stripping all of my clothes off in a drunken rage while laughing at me and challenging me to go ahead and try to escape while I was naked. The last night of abuse was by far the worst. Before Steve started drinking that night, I told him that my son, 3 years old, was not feeling very well, and I was going to stay with him as he fell asleep. My plan was to spend the night with my son. At around 2:30 in the morning, I heard the bedroom door open. I lied there pretending to be asleep. Several seconds went by. I held my breath as tears began to form in my eyes. When I suddenly felt his hand on top of my head, he grabbed my hair and yanked me out of bed, whispering in my ear,
"I know you're avoiding me."
Once in the living room, he threw me on the floor, then accused me of trying to leave him and demanded to know why. Before I could answer, he angrily came to the conclusion that it was another man.
"I swear to God, if I catch you with another man, I'll kill you and him."
He was obviously more drunk than normal. He punched and kicked me a couple of times, and I fell to the floor. I started to crawl to my son's room, and he slowly came from behind me, asking,
"Where do you think you're going?"
He then walked in front of me, kneeled down, and said,
"You stay right there or I'm gonna hurt you real bad."
He then sat on the couch and watched me as I sobbed on the floor. After about 30 minutes, it appeared that he passed out on the couch. I decided that this was my chance to escape. I put on an oversized shirt, picked up my son, and slowly crept by him. He suddenly woke up and grabbed my leg and said,
"Where are you going?"
I stammered out that I was going into the kitchen with my son to get him a drink. He then angrily replied,
"Hurry up."
As soon as I entered the kitchen, I ran out of the front door with no pants on, no shoes, and no purse. I carried my son all the way to the police station, which was thankfully only a few blocks away. After hours, the way the police station is set up is that you go into a room and press a button and talk to someone on the intercom. I ran in and put my back to the wall and pushed the button behind me as I slowly slid down into a sitting position while holding on to my son, waiting for Steve to burst through the door at any second. I remembered thinking if I was going to be beaten, at least it would be on camera. On the speaker, I heard, "How can I help you?" All I could do was cry. I couldn't even get a word out of my mouth. I didn't know how to explain. 2 officers came out to assist me. A female officer took my son and got him some food, and I went with the male officer to make a report, and he gave me a blanket. After 15 minutes, I heard Steve screaming my name as they brought him down the hallway. I held my breath as if he knew I was behind the door. 30 minutes later, an officer came back with a sergeant. At first, I thought they were going to tell me to go back home and gather my belongings while Steve was being held in custody. Instead, they asked me more questions about his anger issues and if there had been any previous fights. I explained to them Steve's alcohol problem and how he had become increasingly more abusive. They then showed me a list in Steve's handwriting detailing how he would dismember my body in a good spot where I would be buried without being found. He also had possible dates written down with past dates crossed out. I couldn't breathe when I read this, and by this point tears were streaming down my face. I looked at the cop and asked, "What does this mean?" He looked back at me and said, "It means you're lucky." Steve was charged with attempted murder, kidnapping, and assault. I left back home to Arizona before the trial started, but gave a detailed statement before I left. Steve, of course, pled not guilty, but in the end, he received 2 years in prison. Just before I left for Arizona, I received a letter from Steve. It simply read,
"It's not over. You'll always be mine."
I'm a female, and I'm 27. At the time of this story, I was only 19. I was living in Littleton, which is a suburb of Denver. I lived and worked in the same block, working at a hair salon, and lived in an apartment that was across the street. I lived with 4 other people in a studio apartment. Yes, it was chaos. But I was young and dumb, and I worked so much that I was only ever there to sleep. While working at the salon, I met people from all walks of life. Most were nice and hardworking like myself. In the plaza where the salon was located, there happened to be an abundance of loiterers, homeless drunks mostly. There was a particular man who I would often see. He always smelled like booze, but was nice enough. He was quite the flirt, which was a bit uncomfortable for 19-year-old me. On several occasions, he asked me to come hang out and drink with him. I always declined, telling him that I had a boyfriend. For the life of me, I cannot remember this man's name, so for the sake of the story, I will call him Mark. One afternoon, after getting off work around 4, I began to make my way across the parking lot to the coffee shop. I ordered my drink and took it outside to sit and enjoy the sunny weather. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Mark approaching me rapidly. A broad smile was on his face. He came up to me and asked me for a lighter. Begrudgingly, I obliged, passing it over. Mark lit up a cigarette and returned the lighter to me, as he not so gracefully brushes my arm. A disgusting chill ran up my spine. I pulled away and suddenly stood up, saying that it was time for me to go. Mark then begged me to come drink with him, and again, I refused. After that, I didn't see him for several weeks. It was a bliss, since he was always lurking around the plaza, waiting for some sorry soul to look his way. One night, I decided to go for a night stroll. I enjoy night walks around this time of year because of the weather. I would walk around downtown Littleton and loop back to my apartment complex. I was maybe 10 minutes away from my home when a figure appeared in the walkway ahead of me. I thought it was nothing at first, since a lot of people were out and about. But when I got a closer look, I could recognize that it was Mark. He was swaying this way and that on the sidewalk, nearly falling into the road. This is where I made my first mistake. I should have crossed the road or turned around. Instead, I decided to walk past him, hoping that he wouldn't recognize me in his intoxicated state. But unfortunately, he did. Mark got in my way and stopped, smiling that broad smile once again. I sighed, resigning to my fate of having to walk with him. I asked him how he had been, and if he was having a good day. He said he was, but it would be a whole lot better if he had someone to drink with. I said that I couldn't, because I had to work early the next morning. Unfortunately, he was unbothered and continued to beg, trying the drunk puppy dog eyes on me. I was slightly uneasy, but otherwise unmoved. Awkwardly laughing, I tried to edge my way around him, but he held out his arms, blocking my path. With a serious face, I demanded Mark move out of my way so I could return home. For some reason, this flipped a switch within him. Suddenly, he grabbed my arm, holding it tightly. I winced and I tried to shake him off, but Mark wouldn't let go. He took another step towards me and grabbed my other arm. Immediately, I knew it was going to bruise. The pain sent me into fight or flight, and I picked both. First, I shoved Mark as hard as I could into a bush that was behind him, and then I started sprinting down the sidewalk. I didn't stop until I burst through my apartment door. I dissolved into tears and fell on the floor. Alarmed, my roommates comforted me and started asking me questions about what happened. After I pulled my shit together, I told them what Mark did. By this time, my boyfriend was in the apartment and was furious upon hearing this. He stormed out of the apartment with a bat in his hand. Another roommate stayed with me. When my boyfriend returned, he said that he couldn't find him. We thought about calling the cops, but rejected the idea because we weren't exactly on the right side of the law ourselves. Marijuana wasn't legal yet in Colorado. So instead, I decided to buy some pepper spray and start carrying a knife on my person. It made me feel much safer, and I stopped going for walks after dark, unless my boyfriend went with me. Strangely, I never saw Mark again after that night, though I was completely okay with it. So wherever you may have gone, Mark, just leave me alone. Next time, I'll poke a hole in you. I'm writing this after a lot of contemplating whether I should or not, but I've decided that people should hear my story to be more aware. It's been 6 years since this happened, and as I'm writing this, I still get paranoid just thinking about it. I'm going to be pretty vague with the details. To this day, I'm still frightened. I'm a 23-year-old female, but at the time of this story I had just turned 17. I was working as a waitress. After a while of working at this restaurant, this guy was hired on as a cook. We'll call him John. John seemed pretty harmless at first. I was, and still am, a very nice person, and I try not to be rude to anyone unless they give me a reason to be. And even then, I try my best to avoid confrontation. Everyone at work was pretty friendly, and we would often joke around and prank each other. Eventually, John joined in on the work shenanigans. I should note, I never flirted or showed any romantic interest in this man, and when we joked around, it was always in a group. It was never just me and him alone. One night at work, after closing, I went outside to smoke, and John was out there as well. We started making small talk about work, and then we got on the subject of tickets and fines that we had to pay. I told him about a speeding ticket I had gotten a couple of weeks before, and I had no idea how I was going to pay for it, due to me not making enough with the hours I was working, and because I was still attending high school, I didn't have the time to work more hours. Now fast forward a few weeks. During this time we chatted and made small talk, but again I will say that I never flirted with him or showed any romantic interest. It was Valentine's Day. We were slammed with customers, and I was on the register trying to cash out a long line. That's when, out of the corner of my eye, I saw John just standing there, doing nothing but staring at me. Employees had to use the register to clock in and out, so naturally I thought he was clocking out, so I told him to give me a second, and I would let him slide in and clock out. Soon I finished up with the last customer, and motioned for John to step up and use the computer. All of a sudden he hands me a giant box of chocolates, and says, "Happy Valentine's." He then clocks out and leaves. I just stood there in confusion. Earlier that night, I had been bitching to a friend of mine about how my boyfriend wouldn't even give me a card for the holiday. And now I'm just standing here with a large box of chocolates. What just happened? Why did he get me something? Did he overhear my conversation from earlier and felt bad for me? Or did he really have a thing for me? Very soon, I would have the answer to that question. I brushed off the incident, and after that night, I didn't see him again for about a week, due to him working the morning shift and me working the evening shift. One day I had to go to work right after school, and I decided just to do my hair and makeup in my car in the parking lot, right before I went in. As I'm finishing up, I saw a car pull in next to mine. Soon after, I heard someone shouting my name. I look over, and guess who? It was John. He looked excited and told me to come over. I got out of my car and made my way over to the passenger side. With the window down, I asked, "Hey John, what's up?" He then told me to get in. So what did the stupid teenage girl do? She got in the 30-year-old's car. I sat there nervously, palms sweating, heart racing. He pulled out a rose. It was one of those artificial ones that you find at gas stations. And then he pulled out a wad of cash. It was like one of those drug deal scenes you see in movies. He shoved the wad into my hand and told me that was for me. I just sat there with my mouth open. Feeling the money in my hand made it almost feel like I was holding something heavy. I struggled to find words, and it was even harder making the choice if I should take it or not. I mean, what teenager doesn't want a roll of cash? But I knew that if I took it, there would be strings attached. I felt like I sat there for an eternity, but it was only about 5 seconds, and then I asked him, "What's this for, John?" He then replied, "It's for your speeding ticket. I've been in a lot of trouble with the law before, and I don't want to see anything happen to you." The next thought that popped into my head was, what did I have to do for this money? And I didn't like the answer I came up with. I sat there for a few more moments, until morals and common sense took a firm hold of my mind. I laid the cash on his dash and said, "Look, I appreciate the offer. I really do, but I can't accept it. It's your money, and it's my screw-up, so I should pay for it." After that, I hopped out and went inside and clocked in. That night went pretty normal. Every so often, I would catch John giving me this sad look, and I sort of felt bad for him. I gave him the benefit of the doubt, thinking that maybe he was just lonely and needed a friend. So after that, we hung outside of work a few times. Looking back, I'm aware that this wasn't the smartest choice, being a 17-year-old girl hanging out with a 30-year-old. John was acting really odd outside of work, like a person that just gives you really bad vibes in the pit of your stomach. He would make a few passes at me, and I would politely excuse myself. Eventually, I stopped hanging out with him altogether. I sent him a short but nice text saying that I wasn't interested in a relationship, but apparently, he wasn't going to accept that. He would send me endless text messages, and would often call me trying to get me to hang out with him. Every time he was working the same shift I was, he would give me one of those gas station roses. I would cringe and accept it because, again, I was 17, and avoided confrontation at all costs. He was a 30-year-old man, and I was a teenage girl. I avoided him as much as possible. I even asked my boss for the working hours where John was off. Soon after, I started to ignore the texts. He eventually got fired for no call, no show. A month or two had passed, and I eventually quit myself. I had gotten a new number and switched phone companies. One night, as I was picking up my best friend from her boyfriend's, I was waiting in the car for her to come outside so we could go to my house. My phone then started to vibrate with multiple text message notifications. I picked up my phone and noticed that it was all from the same number. In total, there was 10 messages. I started to read and was so confused at first as to who was sending me their entire life story in a text so late at night. But as I started to gather the puzzle pieces, it suddenly clicked. It was John. I can't remember exactly what the messages said, but to sum it up, he was confessing his undying love for me, and didn't understand why I was ignoring him, and why I had changed my number. I was so nauseous, I felt my stomach churning inside me on the spot. How the hell did he get my new number? At this point, my best friend had hopped in the car, but I didn't look up from my phone screen. She must have noticed how uneasy I looked after I didn't answer her. She leaned over and saw the phone in my hand. She took it from me and read the texts out loud, and then suggested that I call my mom. I knew that my mom would be angry with me if she found out that a grown man was contacting me. So I told her that that wasn't a good idea. Right then, I got a call from a different number. I answered, "Hello?" And then I heard slow, deep breathing. And then the line suddenly went dead. My best friend, who we'll call V, said, "You should block that number." To which I did. But over the next month, I still got random texts and calls from different numbers. I would never text back and blocked every single one. Some of the calls I did answer, and I would hear that same disturbing breathing before hanging up. Eventually, everything stopped altogether, after I ignored them for so long. Fast forward about 6 months, and every single aspect of my life had changed. I moved out of my mom's place, and got my own little rundown apartment right before I turned 18. I had a new boyfriend, who I'll call James, who also moved in with me. I switched schools, changed my number again, and got a new car due to the transmission on my old one going bad. I also had a new job at a medical facility in housekeeping. There was a lot of changes that I went through. James and I didn't feel comfortable getting mail at our place due to some of the shady people in our area, so we got everything sent to my mom's house. Every Monday, I would swing by my mom's, do some laundry, and get my mail from the week before. So one day while I was over there, I had started some laundry and made myself comfortable on the couch, trying to enjoy my only day off from work that week. My mom walked in and tossed me my mail, and informed me that there was a written piece of mail addressed to me. This piqued my interest, because who writes letters anymore? So I skimmed through my mail, tossing the junk aside, and eventually found the letter that she had mentioned. It was a regular white envelope with my name on it. At this time, I had just turned 18, so once a year I would get birthday cards from a few out-of-state relatives, but over the years I learned to tell by the handwriting who it was, and I didn't recognize this handwriting at all. I looked at the return address, and to my surprise, it was the address of the restaurant I used to waitress at months prior. I thought to myself, maybe it was a check that I never picked up? But then again, I had gotten paid through direct deposit into a linked student account my mom set up for me, so that wouldn't make any sense. Maybe my old boss was trying to contact me? No, it couldn't be. He had my mom's number as an emergency contact, so if he needed to reach out to me, why wouldn't he just dial that number? I was dying of curiosity at this point, so I ripped open the letter, and as I read the first sentence, my blood ran cold, and I stood up straight off the couch as I felt a wave of panic run through my body. It was John. The letter was made up of 2 front and back pages. I felt so sick. How the hell did he get my mother's address? The letter stated that he missed me, loved me, and said that he hadn't felt this depressed since his mother died a few years back. He wrote that he wanted to be with me, and that he would give me whatever I wanted, a house, car, and even kids. This letter was a combination of desperate, delusional, and disturbing. I was only 18 years old. Did he honestly think that I wanted children? At the bottom of both of the pages, he left his contact info. But what scared me the most about this stupid little love letter is that there was no postage stamps. This guy had driven to my mom's house and put it directly in the mailbox himself. So now I'm standing there in tears, frozen in fear, as my mom walks up to me and asked me what was wrong. I didn't realize she was standing there the whole time, watching me read this letter, in fear that she would flip out if she knew the truth. I wiped my eyes and lied to her, and told her that it was an old friend from high school, informing me that another friend had passed. Thinking back on it now, it was pretty far-fetched, but she bought it, and I folded up the letter and shoved it in my pocket. I finished up my laundry and left. On my way home, I stopped at a gas station to fill up, and as I'm waiting for my car to be topped off, I pull the letter out of my pocket and glance over it one more time, before tearing it up into tiny pieces and throwing it into a trash can, hoping so desperately that that would be the end of it. During the drive home, I kept asking myself over and over, why me? Suddenly I realized that if he went through the trouble of dropping a handwritten letter off at my mom's house, what else was he capable of? I knew that somewhere deep in my gut, he was going to try and confront me if I didn't respond to that letter. I waited about a week to tell James, and when I did, he was extremely upset. First at John for pulling a stunt like this, and then at me for waiting so long to tell him. However, James came to the same conclusion that I did, and he bought me a baseball bat to keep in the trunk of my car and a bottle of mace to carry in my purse. Another 2 weeks went by. Things were pretty normal for the most part, so I pretty much forgot about John and the nerve-wracking situations that he would put me through, or at least I put the memories in the back of my mind. The weekday started off as normal. I woke up, got dressed, kissed James goodbye, and picked up some breakfast on my way to school, and attended classes as normal. Keep in mind that when John and I worked together, he was driving a blue car, so that was usually what I would keep an eye out for. I walked out of my school, got in my car, and pulled out of the parking lot. I was on my way to where I worked at the time. I had just hopped on the interstate and went down one exit and got off. My grandfather lived near my work, and I did have some time to go see him before I started my shift, so I'm stopped at a traffic light, and I glanced into my rearview mirror and saw a red car behind me with a man driving who had sunglasses on and his sun visor pulled down. But I could tell that this man looked like John. I thought to myself I was just being paranoid because John drove a blue car. I continued with my drive, but I noticed that this red car was riding my ass the entire way, making every turn and switching lanes whenever I did. When I turned onto the back road that led to my grandfather's place and saw the red car following me, and I realized that this was in fact John. And it was at this point that I started to panic. I floored it, trying to get him off my tail, so I made up the quickest plan that I could think of. Pull into the driveway and run inside to my grandfather and tell him what was going on. I pulled in and stopped, but before I could jump out and run inside, John was already out of his car, walking up to mine and shouting my name. At this point, I was terrified and shaking. He gets to my car and pulls open the door and is now blocking my path to the front door of the house. I looked up and saw the rage in his eyes. Everything happened so fast I can barely remember what was said. I do vaguely remember asking him why he was following me and how did he know where to find me, assuming that he had followed me from my school, which meant that he sat in his car for God knows how long, waiting for me to get out. All he said in response was, "I need to talk to you." I refused and told him that I was going to call the police. His response was, "I don't care. I just came here to see you." At this point, I bursted out of my car, taking John by surprise as I pushed past him. I flew up the steps and flung open the door and ran inside. I could have made the US Olympic team if they saw how fast I hauled ass. I was bawling my eyes out, scared out of my mind, shaking from adrenaline and shock. My grandfather was in the living room, asking me who was yelling outside, and the only words I could get out of my mouth was, "He followed me here." I turned around to see my great uncle standing there with a shotgun in his hand. He then followed my grandfather outside. My grandfather confronted John in his driveway. "You see that road, boy?" He pointed. "You best get your ass on it now." I was standing on the porch next to my uncle, who had his arm over my shoulder, trying to comfort me with a shotgun in his other hand. At that moment, I thanked God for my redneck family. John shot me this horrible look, as if to say, "This isn't over by a long shot," and then he sped off. My grandfather then told me that he was going to follow me home for the next few days. I also had co-workers walk with me to my car and would have James greet me in the driveway every night. Fast forward about a month. By this point, paranoia was controlling my life. I couldn't go anywhere by myself. I deleted all my social media accounts and would see a counselor at my school on a regular basis. I would even have the resource officer walk me to and from the parking lot. I was always looking over my shoulder with each step, and was still having coworkers walk me to my car every night. It's safe to assume that everybody at my work knew what was going on. After having off a Monday and returning to work on Tuesday as scheduled, I went outside to catch a quick smoke and joined the company of this older woman that I worked with. She was outside the smoking area, waiting for me with news that sent chills down my spine. Apparently, while I was off that Monday, a man came in looking for me. The staff knew that I was off and said they couldn't disclose any information about me. He told them okay and left. Fast forward to 3 in the morning, and a coworker of mine who had a similar appearance to me, who was unaware that I was being stalked and harassed, had gotten off when she noticed someone in a red car was following her. It followed her all the way to her home, and this poor girl lived over 30 miles away in a different county with her mother and 3 kids. So when she pulled into the driveway and noticed that the car was still behind her, she called her mother and told her to grab her gun and come outside. Her mother did as she said and exited the house gun drawn. My coworker stepped out of her car and tried to get a look at the driver, but was blinded by his headlights. I'm guessing that this is when John realized that the girl was not me, and quickly drove out of there. After I heard this, I broke down crying and apologized over and over to that girl. I felt horrible. My problems were starting to affect other people. What if he had broken into her house, or worse? That thought scares me to this day. This was the last major incident with John. I actually did research on him a couple years later. However, I'm sad to say that it didn't turn out much. A lot of traffic tickets and a suspended driver's license. But other than that, nothing. Every so often I do try to keep tabs on him, because I refuse to be a victim again. I will say that he never threatened me, or physically harmed me in any way, but it's just the fact that he went to such great lengths to hunt me down, which in its own way is very unnerving. I have since moved again, gotten married, and very recently started a family. And I would say that I'm very happy that I've moved on with my life. But just the other night after returning home from a long shift, I noticed one of those artificial roses, the kind that you find in gas stations, laying on my front doorstep. This happened to me about 4 years ago. I'm 23 now, so I was 19 at the time that this took place. I was up late one night playing video games as I usually did on the weekends. I remember very clearly that it was storming that night. It was a pretty bad one too. The wind outside had to be up to around 50 miles per hour, and the rain was coming down hard. I was worried about my power possibly going out, as it was a common occurrence whenever it stormed. After a few hours of playing my game, I began to get hungry, so I made my way into the kitchen to make a snack. I live in a mobile home community, so each home sits pretty close to each other. As I was making a sandwich, I heard a few popping sounds from outside. At first, I just assumed that it was thunder, but then I heard a couple of more pops. I looked out the window that was next to the back door, which was facing the direction I had heard the noises from. I really couldn't see much, other than the dim light emanating from a nearby lamppost that overlooked the street behind my house. Thinking that it was just the storm, I finished up in the kitchen and shut off all the lights and went back to my gaming. After about 10 minutes, I could have sworn that I heard a noise coming from my front door. I had a motion light that would go off at even the slightest movement anywhere near my front porch, so I looked out of my bedroom window and I could see the glare of light coming from my front porch. Having heard the noise and seeing the light now, I knew that someone or something had triggered it. I was home alone, and I was getting a bit creeped out. I made my way through the dark house into the front door. The door had a diamond-shaped window at the center of it, and I crouched down to keep myself from view. I slowly lifted my head and peeked out, but nothing was there. I opened the door and stepped out into the rainy night, and still I saw nothing. I went back inside and locked the door behind me. As I was making my way back to my room, I could see the flashing of red and blue lights from a cop car coming through the window on my back door. I went over to the door and saw at least 3 cop cars sitting on the road. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I could see 2 officers talking to someone who lived in one of the mobile homes on that street. I watched for a while until I got bored and went back into my room. It wasn't until the next day that I saw on the news something that scared me to my very core. The noises that I heard the night before turned out to be gunshots. According to the police, it was a drug deal that had gone wrong. 2 men had been gunned down, killed execution style. One man was shot in the head, and the other was shot a few times in the chest while sitting down in a chair. The police had reason to believe that this was gang-related. One of the men were identified after a family member reported him missing. The other victim was the owner of the mobile home, who had set up a meeting with the drug dealers. Needless to say, things went south fast. I came forward to the police after having seen the news reports. I am completely convinced that what I heard on my porch that night was the man who had just killed those 2 men trying to get into my home. as the police were called very soon after the shots were heard. I told the police this, and they also agreed that the killer was seeking a place to hide, and just happened to choose my home as there was no car outside, and he may have thought nobody was there. But once he heard me walking down the hall, he must have ran off into the night. I'm not sure what happened after this, or if the man was ever caught, because I never heard back from the police after giving my statement. It scares me to think what could have happened if that man chose to break open my door, or if I hadn't heard the noises coming from my porch. I very well could have been the next victim. I consider myself very lucky that I never encountered the killer that night. Always be safe. You never know who's out there in the dark.
There's always a reason to be afraid.
I'm 22 now, but this happened when I was 16. At the time, I lived in Staten Island, New York. For a little background, I'm a female, and at the time, I was 120 pounds soaking wet, with a height of 5'6". I thought I was invincible. I never imagined anything like this would have ever happened to me. It was March 17th of 2013, around 10:30 p.m. I was leaving my boyfriend's house. He walked me to the local bus stop as he always did. We joked and laughed while we waited for my bus to show up. Because it was kind of late, there weren't many cars on the street. I happened to notice a black SUV parked across the road. I didn't think much of it at the time. My bus eventually showed up, and I said goodbye to my boyfriend, and I boarded. I took a seat next to the bus driver. The rest of the bus was completely empty. The driver turned to me once we hit the first red light, and then he asked, "What are you doing out this late?" It was random and a bit creepy. I replied with, "I was just hanging out with my boyfriend." We made small talk, and my initial apprehension was put at ease. The driver then told me that it wasn't exactly safe to be out and about at this hour, and that I should be more careful. I nodded, but as I said before, I was an arrogant 16-year-old who thought she was invincible. As my stop approached, I looked at my phone. The time read 11:30 p.m. My phone's battery was down to 5%. Oh, that's great, I thought to myself as I exited the bus and said my goodbyes to the driver. He told me to stay safe, and I gave him another nod as the door folded back shut. For some reason, I just stood there and watched the bus make its way down the street until its taillights were well out of sight. As I stood there at the empty stop, a sensation of what I can only describe as impending doom came over me. I made my way to the bench to sit down. The bus that dropped me off near my house was scheduled to arrive at 11:40. Only 10 minutes. As I sat there staring off into space, thinking about some things I had to do when I got home, a black SUV pulls up to the bus stop. The uneasy feeling I had earlier intensified. But I did my best to play it cool. The man rolls down his window and asks me, "Hey, excuse me, do you know what time the bus is supposed to be here?" He appeared to be a mix between Spanish and Asian, and had a medium build. At this point, I did not make the connection that this may have been the same vehicle I saw just before I boarded the first bus. I figured that he was probably just waiting for somebody, so I replied, "It shouldn't be long." He then asked me how long I had been waiting. It was then that I started to get a little freaked out. This guy was giving me the creeps. But I considered that I might be just overreacting. Perhaps he was just trying to pass the time. But still, I kept my guard up. I answered that I hadn't been waiting long. He then proceeded to try to make more small talk. I was trying to be polite. But I also kept looking at my pitch black phone screen, trying to subtly hint to him that I wasn't interested in conversation. It was dark out by this point. The only luminescence was coming from some distant streetlights. However, there were also two big trees outside the bus stop that were positioned in such a way that they blocked out most of the light, so if this guy tried anything, the dark would have provided decent cover. I nervously clenched my phone, the uncomfortable feeling inside increasing with every passing second. He then told me that he was new to the area and didn't know his way around too well. He claimed that he was in the army and was stationed nearby. He then asked me where the beach was. "It's just down the street." I told him in a very matter-of-fact way, as if to convey, maybe you should go there so I don't have to look at you anymore. It was then that our eyes met. I could see his face very clearly. His eyes were not like any normal human's eyes. It was as if they were looking right through me, staring at me like a hungry fox who just discovered a trapped, defenseless rabbit. He then asked me, "Do you mind if you show me around? Come on, get in the car for a little while." I may have been a naive 16-year-old, but I was not an idiot. I knew that if I got in that car, that would be the last time anyone ever heard from me. I was trying my best to show him that I wasn't afraid, so I politely declined while looking down the street for my bus. He then began to beg and plead. It was really kind of pathetic. I told him no once again. He then said something that I will never forget. "Come on, baby. It won't take long. I promise." At that moment, my blood ran cold, and my stomach felt like it was going to drop right out of my ass. I felt absolutely sick, like I was going to throw up, but I kept my cool, and thankfully my bus was now in sight and coming down the street. A feeling of relief washed over me. I told him no once again, thinking that would be the end of it. He then told me that he would drive me home right afterward. This guy would not give up, and I finally had enough. With all the strength and courage in me, I shouted, "No, leave me the hell alone, you fucking loser!" As my bus pulled up, I heard him say something genuinely terrifying. And I quote, "Fine, bitch, I'll just follow you and see where you live." My heart started to race. My hands broke out in a cold sweat, and my body began to tremble with fear. I quickly got on the bus, and honestly, I don't know why I didn't tell the bus driver. I think I was just in a state of shock and was hoping that Mr. Jailbait Hunter in the SUV didn't mean what he said, and that he was just pissed off and trying to scare me. When I sat down and looked out of the window, I saw the headlights of the SUV. They were tailing the bus. I thought I was going to have a mental breakdown. When the bus arrived at my stop, I ran like hell. I reached the front door of my house, which was usually unlocked, but tonight, of all nights, it was locked from top to bottom. I frantically rang the doorbell while going through my bag to find my keys. I then heard someone pull up out front. Without turning around, I knew who it was. Just like in the movies, I dropped the keys as I was trying to put them in the front door. I finally managed to unlock my front door. Before turning the handle, I heard a car door slam shut from behind me. I quickly ran inside and slammed the door shut. In a panic, I explained to my mother and my older brother what happened. My brother ran outside and looked up and down the street. I was shaking, absolutely consumed by terror. My emotions finally got the best of me, and I could no longer hold back my tears. We called the police, and they came and searched the area. They asked me if I had gotten a tag number, and unfortunately, I had to tell the officers that it was too dark to see. But I did notice a sticker of some sort of bird on the backseat driver's side window. It didn't dawn on me until they left that this had been the same SUV that was across the street when I was with my boyfriend an hour prior. They told me that they checked the army base nearby and the surrounding area, but nobody had seen any vehicle matching the description I gave. All I could think about was what the bus driver had said to me and the irony of what took place that same night. Years went by, and I didn't think much about this incident after that night. One day, I was scrolling through Facebook when I came across a picture my friend had posted. It was a story of a man who had been following her home from work for the past 3 days, and it was the same guy who I encountered 5 years prior. My heart felt like it was going to leap out of my throat. Looking at the post, I noticed that several other women had come forward, and they all shared similar experiences to mine. I ended up finding out that he almost kidnapped a 13-year-old girl. She allowed herself to be lured into his car, but once inside, she noticed a roll of duct tape, some rope, a pair of gloves, and a bottle of what turned out to be chloroform on the floorboard. She ended up jumping out of the window while they were stopped at a red light. I don't know all the details, but apparently he got physical with another woman who was pregnant and tried to force her into his car. He got pretty ballsy and started trying to abduct women in broad daylight. The news found out that his name was Leo, and it was also discovered that he had a wife and 2 daughters, who were around 3 and 5. They interviewed his neighbors, and to my surprise, they defended him, saying that all these women were just lying. It's truly unbelievable how stupid people are. 5 separate accounts from 5 different women who have no connection with each other have come forward and shared their experiences. Could you please dislodge your head from your ass and face up to the facts? Anyway, to this day, I have no idea whatever became of him. The last I heard, he was still at large. I hope they caught him, so no other young women have to be subjected to this monster ever again. To start things off, I'm a 26-year-old female, and I'm also quite petite, which makes me appear a lot younger than I really am. I am a New Hampshire resident, and I live a rather short distance away from a state hospital known as Concord. I used to work in the Steeplegate Mall, which unfortunately has been dying due to the lack of foot traffic, so naturally many stores ended up shutting down. Because of that, the mall has become more of a dead zone by the day, making it a hotspot for shady people. There have been many times where I've cashed out people who were clearly under the influence of heavy drugs. I'm not sure if it was heroin or whatever, but you could just tell by looking at these people and trying to communicate with them that they just weren't all there. Some of these customers would even walk in bleeding without even knowing it. Now that you understand the details, let's get into the story. One night, me and my friend, who I'll refer to as Tony, decided to take an Uber into town. I was feeling a bit down over some drama that was happening in my personal life, so Tony wanted to cheer me up and get me out of the house for a bit. We were having a great time going into the stores and getting in our exercise. The mall would be closing soon, so we decided to take advantage of my discount and grab something to eat. We exited the mall, and it was about 8 p.m., so it was pretty dark outside. The parking lot was mostly empty aside from a few cars. We were making our way to the art store when we suddenly saw a white car drop someone off. This person appeared to be male, but we couldn't quite see his face, and he soon disappeared into the bushes. Tony was keeping an eye on the man, while I was watching the driver peel out of the parking lot. We both thought that was the end of the white car, but less than a minute later, the car came back, attempting to get closer to us. He would peel out on the pavement, getting more and more aggressive the closer he got. Tony and I were both beyond scared by this point. It felt as if my heart was about to pop out of my throat, and Tony looked like she was in utter shock or disbelief. I quickly started looking around for a place that we could possibly hide, and I saw the back door to a Bon-Ton that went out of business, and suggested to Tony that we should make a break for that door. Our legs were sore from all the walking we had done that day, but the primal fear that we were both feeling propelled us forward, and we booked it through the back door, figuring that it would at least buy us some time, and we could call for help. However, we entered a small room that had another door that led into the main area, and that door was locked, preventing us from going any further. We pulled out our phones, and my heart sank once I realized that my phone was dead, and Tony's phone was glitching so bad that it was unusable. She was struggling with her phone, and we both heard the car slowly drive by the door. I immediately felt my stomach drop, and I thought that this was the end. This psychopath was going to kidnap me and my friend, and this is how we would die. Luckily, the driver lost interest and drove off. It took a lot of courage for us just to open the door and leave. After multiple attempts of restarting her phone, Tony was finally able to get it to work. She then called up an Uber to drive us home. The next day, I brought this up to my boss, and she told me there had been a lot of suspicious people coming through that end of the mall, where a charter school was located. Apparently, some sketchy individuals have been spying on children, and that mall security would be patrolling that area more thoroughly. Tony and I are now convinced that this person may have thought we were kids that attended the school. In early September, the store that I worked at ended up closing, and not even a month after I stopped working there was a shooting in the mall parking lot. It was ruled as a murder-suicide. A woman was shot by her boyfriend, and then he turned the gun on himself. He was found dead on the scene, and the woman was taken to the hospital, where she later succumbed to her injuries. After being harassed in the parking lot that night, and now hearing about the shooting, let's just say that Tony and I will be staying far away from that area from now on. Clearly, it's not a very safe place to be. We both learned a valuable lesson that night. Never walk through a parking lot in spots where most people can't see you, especially at night. And always make sure your phone is charged, because you never know when you might need it. This happened about 5 or 6 years ago. I was in my mid-20s, and I lived in a small town with access to a lake, which made it a popular spot for tourists from the northern suburbs of Chicago. It was early in the fall, so tourist season was winding down, and things were starting to return to a more quiet, if not somewhat boring pace. I was off of work that day, and I decided to get out and enjoy some fresh air. For me, this often meant sitting on a park bench and watching the lake and all of its comings and goings for a while, before getting up to walk down the lakefront and over to the beach house. I slowly wandered across the park and over to this old wooden bench that went over a creek that fed into the lake. This led to a small sidewalk that extended to a side access road. People like to set up lawn chairs and sit in the grass in this area. There was also this large tree that had to have been there for a century or more that served as a natural rally point. I was approaching that tree when I stopped to take in the view. It was at this point that I realized that I had left my phone at home. There were no chairs up that day, and I was the only one on the sidewalk. Traffic on the main road had been pretty light, and there was only one car parked on the access road. It was a perfect day, but as I stood there, I heard the unmistakable sound of a car slowly pulling up behind me. I didn't think anything of it at first. I was fully expecting the vehicle to pass me and pull up into one of the parking spots. However, it didn't. My next thought was that my dad may have come down to see what I was up to. He also liked to hang out at the same park like I did, but when I didn't hear the familiar greeting, I started to pay closer attention. I always look like I'm totally lost in thought when I'm out there, but I actually do keep a pretty good eye on my surroundings, and the idling vehicle behind me was putting me on edge. Once in a while, people stop at odd spots to snap pictures of the lake, but I got the feeling that it wasn't the lake that was being watched. It was me. I peered over my shoulder and saw a red Ford Windstar minivan sitting there. The windows were tinted, but I can make out that there was a man sitting in the driver's seat, and he was looking right at me. But the one thing that got me the most was the sight of the front license plate. It read, and I kid you not, Skinner. I gave this van a good once-over to let the driver know that I saw him. I also did my best to make my posture seem like I wasn't nervous, that I was alert. I decided to move a bit further down the sidewalk, like I wasn't unsettled by Mr. Skinner and his minivan. I stopped again when I heard the sound of his tires rolling over the pavement. He was following me, doing his best to keep at about 10 feet away. I started going over what-if scenarios in my head. I could see a creep wanting to hang around and stalk me if I was a attractive woman or something, but I'm a fat guy of average height, so I never considered that I would be the target of an abduction. I glanced around again, and I saw no one else walking down the sidewalk. It was just me and the van. I decided to walk off the concrete and into the grass, like I was going to stand by the water. I made my way around that big tree and stood out of sight. I started listening for the van doors, but all I heard was the sound of the engine idling. The driver wasn't getting out, but he wasn't leaving either. I began wondering how long he would sit there and wait, so I stayed out of sight for a good 10 minutes, hoping that he would get bored. Finally, I saw a figure coming from the direction of the beach. It was an old man, maybe in his late 70s. I reached into my pocket where I kept a knife. I figured this old guy was going to be my ticket to break this waiting game with Mr. Skinner. He was either going to make his move, in which case I would be ready, or he was going to bug out because we weren't alone anymore. As the old man got closer, I could tell that he was eyeing me and the minivan. I came out from around the tree and back into Skinner's view and began walking toward the old man. My hand was still in my pocket as I approached him. He looked a little unsure of me. I made a big show of being very friendly with him. I contemplated telling the old guy that the van was following me and to call the police when he got to a phone, but I decided not to. When we finally got within a few feet of each other, we struck up a conversation. As I started commenting on how it was a great day for a walk, I heard the minivan move again. It crept past us back onto the main road and drove away. The old man half turned to watch it, and after it was gone, he made mention that the guy was just sitting there staring at me. I laughed a bit and told him that was why I was behind the tree. After the old man went on his way, I milled around that part of the sidewalk for about 5 minutes, trying to figure out what the guy in the minivan wanted and why he had chosen that for a license plate. I happened to look back towards the park, and just beyond that was my car. I had parked just off the main intersection because the park was right there. I thought about turning around and heading back, calling it quits and moving on from the strange ordeal, and that's when I saw him. The red Windstar was turning on to the main east-west street and was heading my way again. I took out my knife and quickly flipped open the blade and started picking out my thumbnail with it. He missed the turn to get back onto the side road, but he slowed way down as he passed. He stared straight at me the entire time, and this time I made sure he saw that I had a knife in my hand. Once he passed by, he accelerated and vanished in the same direction that he had gone the first time. I was pretty confident that he would make a third pass, and if I was still in the open and alone, he would come back and we would have another weird standoff. Whatever he was up to, this time I wasn't going to be in the open for him. If he really wanted me, he would have to come looking. I walked further down by the beach. There was a lot of tree cover there. There were a few cubbies for people to sit in and watch the beach, so I camped out in one and waited for the van. I figured that he wasn't coming back after about a half hour, and at this point, I just wanted to go home. I walked back the way I had come from, keeping a watchful eye out for Mr. Skinner, who I'm glad to say never did make his return. To this day, I have no idea what the guy wanted. His plates were Wisconsin plates, but I had never seen that van before, and I asked around town, and no one else could recall a van of that same make and model with that particular license plate. I still think about it from time to time. I often wonder what would have happened if he had gotten out of his van. I always envisioned that he had a syringe or something, and that he would have stuck it into my arm and knocked me out, and from there, I don't know. Thinking about this incident is always followed by the hope that he hasn't done this to someone else. After all, Wisconsin is the state that gave us Ed Gein and Jeffrey Dahmer. I'm just thankful that old man walked up when he did, so I didn't have to find out what Mr. Skinner's real motives were. This took place in my hometown of Weymouth when I was 14. My friends and I decided to go exploring in an abandoned building that was next to some railroad tracks. We figured that we could sneak in through a loading bay that faced the tracks. Our plan was to sneak out at 11 p.m., get there by 11:30, and try and be back at our houses by 1. I will admit that I was scared in the days leading up to it. It was basically unheard of in my town for anyone to do anything remotely risky. But we were young and reckless. We wanted excitement and adventure. The night came, and Tim and Charlie were supposed to meet me by a streetlight near a cafe. And then we would find the tracks and follow them for about a quarter mile until we got to the loading bay. I grabbed a couple of flashlights and headed out my door when my family finally fell asleep. As I was walking down to the cafe, I heard footsteps approaching quickly from behind me. When I turned around, no one was there. I ignored it, thinking that my mind was playing tricks on me. After about 5 minutes, it happened again. Again, I turned around, and there was nothing. I finally got to the cafe where we were supposed to meet. My friends Tim and Charlie were already there, so we proceeded with our plan. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I wasn't about to let my friends know that I was scared. We finally reached the abandoned building. One of the old rusty bay doors was jammed open, just enough for us to slide under it. We entered the building and turned on our flashlights. There was graffiti everywhere. It was obvious that we weren't the only ones that came in here looking for thrills. There was one piece of graffiti that caught my eye. It was a metallic paint that stood out from the rest. It read, "Don't come back." "Hey guys, come check this out." I called out to my friends. I was answered by manic footsteps pounding behind me. I turned, and I saw a tall, skinny man with greasy, wiry hair. He wore horribly ripped clothes. His eyes were wide open, with a huge ear-to-ear smile. I was frozen to the spot, utterly paralyzed by fear. He threw his head back and cackled, and I just stood there in complete horror and shock until my friends started screaming at me to run. That brought me back to reality, and I booked it. As I was approaching the bay door, I still heard the man's footsteps behind me. They were getting louder, and he was closing in. I slid through the door like a baseball player, and as soon as I scrambled to my feet, we made a break for it. But the thing that stuck with me, even to this day, the thing that still chills me to the bone, was the voice that boomed out from the building.
"Don't come back!"
That only made us run faster. "What the hell was that?" Tim panted as we ran. "I don't know," I said. Charlie was so shaken up that he did not say a single word. When we got back to the cafe, we decided that we would all go back to our houses. But there was one thought that kept me up for the rest of the night, one thought that still haunts me to this day. How long had he been following me that night? I'm a female and a freshman in college, attending a local university in my area. I decided to live on campus to get the full college experience, not wanting to miss out on fun opportunities my college had to offer. Starting in a new school already made me nervous, but the idea of being on my own in college made it all the more scary. I've never not had anyone before, being a twin and all, so I've had a built-in best friend pretty much my whole life. My twin, however, went off to a different college, and I was alone. The semester started off like I anticipated. My classes were full of quiet, anxious kids like myself who also didn't know what to expect. There was one kid in my morning history class who put me off. He always wore a dirty baseball cap, cargo pants, and a tattered long t-shirt. He had a chubby face but wasn't extremely overweight, but at the same time he wasn't fit. He had narrow glasses and talked obnoxiously about the most random things to anyone and everyone. He exhibited very strange behavior. I didn't think too much about him as he sat pretty far away from me. I didn't think he would ever bother me. That was until next class came. Our history class had finished up and I was packing my stuff up to leave. I hadn't noticed that this strange guy had come over to my desk until I looked up and saw him hovering over me. I put on a weak smile as I waited for him to say something. "Hi, I'm Connor," he said quietly in a monotone voice. I almost couldn't hear him. "Hi, nice to meet you." Connor didn't say anything else. I thought it was weird, but again, I didn't think much of it. It seemed like a harmless little encounter. That was until our next history class together. Everything went well during the class. I felt fine, and Connor sat in his seat far away from me. As class was dismissed and everyone was packing up their belongings to leave, I was the last one out, as I had to put my reading glasses away and into my backpack. When I looked up at the door, Connor was there waiting for me. He didn't say anything. He just stood at the door watching me. I was very confused as we've never talked before, and he was just standing there giving me this creepy look, watching me pack the rest of my things away. I walked out of the door and he followed me. He casually mentioned the test we had taken that day, trying to brag to me about it, making himself seem above me in a way. "I got a 91 on the test today. No big deal. What about you?" 85, I responded. It was so easy though. His response was very patronizing, and I didn't like it one bit. People who brag always tend to make me mad, and he seemed like one of those types of people. At some point down the stairs, it was a long way down because we were on the 4th floor, he started talking about sweatpants for some reason. He was mumbling so much that I couldn't even hear what he was saying, and to be honest, I was trying to get away from him. I suddenly looked back at him, and he was holding a condom up to my face. "I think you know what I'm talking about," Connor randomly said while giving me a creepy smile. I awkwardly nodded my head, trying to stay collected as we reached the bottom of the stairs. Whatever he had mumbled under his breath couldn't have been good or anything I wanted to talk about with him. When we got outside, he said, "Well, that stuff is awkward to talk about." I wanted to ask why he brought it up to begin with, but I kept to myself and tried to get the hell away from him. I hadn't felt that uncomfortable in a while, and this guy was just giving me the creeps. But I'm not a very confrontational person, and I hate to upset anyone in general. Connor then asked me to a homecoming dance that was being facilitated by a student organization on campus. When I told him that I would be visiting my parents on the day that the dance was supposed to take place, his response unnerved me. "Well, I'm not going to stop you from visiting your parents." After that, I started exercising extreme caution around him. I didn't trust him, not one bit. That may seem obvious, but I'm telling you, you would not want to be alone in a dark alley with this guy. He was really giving off Brock Allen Turner type vibes. So some time passes, and I'm in history class again. That day we were taking a test. He finished his around 8:20. I saw him walk out of the classroom, and I was a bit relieved. I finished up my test around 9:05. I looked at my text messages before exiting the classroom. One of my friends in that class had texted me, "I think Connor is waiting for you." My heart started to beat really fast. There was no way he could be waiting for me. He would have had to have been waiting for 45 minutes. I peeked around the door to look into the waiting area outside of the room, and sure enough, there was Connor, sitting there on his phone, waiting. At this point, I became really scared and confused. Why would he be waiting for me? We were not friends, and I never even hinted at the idea that I would ever be interested in him. I begrudgingly exited the class, and sure enough, he followed me down the stairs yet again, talking about a whole bunch of weird, creepy stuff that I didn't really care much to listen to. Something else that I had been noticing was that he seemed to be moving closer and closer to my desk each class. Turning around and looking at me constantly, it made me feel so uncomfortable. And I would give him this stare that pretty much said, "What the hell are you looking at?" showing him that I saw what he was doing. But he didn't seem to care. He continued to follow me until I pretty much ran away. There was another incident where I was walking into the history building, and Connor was in mid-conversation with this girl from my class. He immediately stopped talking to her and followed me up into the classroom. The creepiest part about all this is that it's still going on. I only have 2 months left with him in my class for this semester. I have tried to raise this issue with the school's administration, and they told me that unless he threatens me or touches me, there wouldn't be anything that they could do. I don't know how much longer I could take this. I have to look over my shoulder every time I go to school. If things get worse, and he becomes more daring with his behavior, who knows what he could do next. Growing up, I lived in a heavily forested area. There's this now abandoned house that was in the woods behind my childhood home. The driveway connected to ours and broke off and circled around our garage and went deeper into the trees. It was a single-story house with a nice big front porch and had an outdoor overhang instead of a full garage. When I was a kid, we had an elderly neighbor who lived back there named Mr. Fisher. He was a Vietnam vet who was partially blind in one eye. He normally wore glasses or an eye patch on the rare occasions that we would see him outside. He kept to himself mostly and never really had any visitors. It was about 20 years ago, back when I was in high school. I was home alone playing on my Nintendo. I remember that it was later in the day and it was raining pretty hard. I was grounded for some reason that I can't remember, and I was bitterly sitting in my room taking out my teenage frustrations on the game, and that's when I heard screaming from behind my house. I paused my game, cracked open my window, and listened. Every few moments I would hear a faint screaming coming from Mr. Fisher's house, maybe 50 or so yards away from my own. I couldn't figure out if it was an angry scream or a terrified one, but I remember just sitting there for a few moments and listening to it, more curious than alarmed. After a few minutes I got bored and shut the window and returned to my video game. I don't know why I didn't call for help or run over and knock on Mr. Fisher's door to see if things were okay. My only explanation was that I was a bitter teenager and I didn't want to be bothered with anything that wasn't my business. Later that night, after my parents came home, I was lying in bed when I once again heard the muffled screaming coming from behind the house. This time I could tell it was labored and ragged, and I can remember being annoyed, wishing that whoever it was would just shut up already. I didn't even mention it to my parents the next morning. So about a week goes by, and I have completely forgotten about the screaming I heard that night. I was outside throwing the football with my father when the mailman stopped his truck and asked us if we had seen Mr. Fisher. Apparently he had not been collecting his mail. My father replied that he hadn't seen his car for a few days, and I remained silent. The mailman and my father walked down the driveway and knocked on Mr. Fisher's door. The next thing I remember were the sirens. An ambulance, a fire engine, and several police cars arrived. I spent most of that afternoon up in a tree, watching Mr. Fisher's house as law enforcement and paramedics went in and out. My father had found Mr. Fisher's front door unlocked. He had been lying in a crumpled heap at the bottom of his basement stairs. It appears that he had fallen and broken both of his legs. But it wasn't the fall that killed him. It was the rats. My father eventually told me that the coroner reported the man had been eaten alive while he was screaming for help, unable to climb back upstairs. He had defensive wounds all over his hands from swatting at them, and several dead rats were scattered around, but in the end, there had been too many of them to fight off. His face had sustained the worst damage. There was almost nothing left of it when they found him. The coroners were convinced that he had been alive through the worst of it. I felt as though I had been stabbed in the stomach, and a wave of traumatizing guilt washed over me, and I broke down in tears. I still didn't tell my parents, but on the inside I was mortified. I felt like a criminal for ignoring those screams. And for weeks after that, I was convinced that the police were going to come back and arrest me for negligence or something. For about a year afterwards, it traumatized me, and I carried the guilt around in secret. I started doing drugs and drinking alcohol to try to dull the pain. In retrospect, I'm extremely lucky I graduated high school without overdosing, or killing someone while being drunk behind the wheel. I was about 20 years old when myself and 3 of my friends went back to the house in late October. The house had been repossessed by the bank at this point, and now sat condemned. Me and my friends sat on the front porch and shared a bottle of bourbon. My family almost considered this vacant house our second home, since it was so close to our property. My father would even do some yard work every once in a while, and make sure nothing was growing on the house. So like I said, my friends and I were drinking and smoking, and being belligerent idiots. Just talking shit and lying about girls that we had slept with. I got up and went around the back of the house to take a piss. I happened to crouch down and glance inside one of those low-to-the-ground basement windows, and just scanned the basement floor. All I could really see was a cracked cement floor, and loads of cobwebs crisscrossing the window. I took care of business, and was about to walk back around front, when I paused. Glancing back towards the window, I felt a sudden sensation that I was being examined. This time, there was something in the window that hadn't been there before. Very clearly, I could see the outline of an old bearded face and a single eye staring up at me, kind of at an angle, as if someone was lifting themselves up to peer out the window. I stared back, my body going numb and my mind going blank. I suppose that this is the part in horror stories where the people would say, "I felt a chill go down my spine," or "my blood ran cold." I didn't feel that way. I just went numb as I looked back at the figure in the window, the unmistakable feeling of being caught in an act washing over me, like I had been vandalizing the place or something. I believe the eye contact lasted for about 10 seconds, maybe slightly more, and I eventually just turned around and walked away. When I got to the front porch, I told my friends I was heading back to my garage. For a few short hours, I was convinced that it had been either a squatter or maybe my imagination. But that night, I had the most horrific nightmare. I was trapped in a dark room with rats crawling all over me and gnawing at my face as I lay helpless. I woke up the next morning feeling sick. What bothered me the most was that whatever I had seen in the basement window, there had only been one eye visible, just like when I remember my old neighbor. It wasn't until I was about 30 years old that I had made peace with the fact that I had seen the man's spirit. He had been staring back at me in distress and confusion, wondering why I hadn't helped him. I have read several books on the paranormal, and I came to the conclusion that his spirit wasn't yet at peace. My parents eventually sold that house to me, and today I only use it as a summer home. But I've never wandered back to the old man's property again. Several times he's made his presence known. A few years ago, I was jump-starting my car outside in the driveway, when suddenly 4 rats shot out from under the axle, between my legs, and scurried away towards Mr. Fisher's old home. Last year, there was a soft knock on my window as I sat in my living room. And only a few months ago, I was awoken from a deep sleep because I thought I could hear screaming from outside. My biggest fear now that I'm an adult is being alone and in pain, and having no one to come and aid me as I scream for help. I guess this is my way of finally getting it off my chest. When I go back there this summer, I plan on returning to Mr. Fisher's house. I will try my best to apologize to him, and I can only hope that this will finally put his spirit at rest. I was 19 at the time of this story. I was living in Littleton, Colorado at the time. For the brief amount of time that I lived there, I had many crazy situations that happened. For now, I will tell you about one in particular. It will help to know what I looked like so you can better understand why this may have happened to me. As I said, I was 19 at the time. I stood at 5'7", 130 pounds. I had wildly colored hair, bright red, several facial piercings, and arm and chest tattoos. It was a warm day, so I was wearing very comfortable clothes, shorts and a tank top, along with a pair of flip-flops and a sun hat. Because of the previous encounters that I've had, I stopped taking night walks. That day, I let my boyfriend take my truck to work since I didn't have to work that day, and I had no plans. But I wanted to surprise him at work and take him to dinner after he got off, so I started walking up Broadway towards Colfax. Now, if you've ever lived in the Denver area for any amount of time, people will generally warn you about Colfax Avenue. It's busy, and some sketchy activity takes place on that street. But for some reason, my oh-so-awesome roommates did not warn me of the many horrors that awaited me on Colfax Avenue. Okay, maybe I'm being a bit dramatic, but my experience was not pleasant. So back to the story. I turned from Broadway onto Colfax. As soon as I turned, it was like stepping into another world. There was a bus stop. I'm pretty sure I saw some guy taking bumps pressed up against the nearest building. Several homeless people were laying and sitting in various places up the street. 2 women were screaming at each other about something that I didn't care to gather. I walked quickly for 2 or 3 blocks with my heart in my throat. I am not cut out for this sort of social interaction. I accidentally made eye contact with a dirty man lurking in an alleyway. I quickly averted my eyes to my flip-flops and kept walking. After a few blocks, the crowd thinned, and I was feeling less on edge. In fact, I was actually starting to enjoy my walk. But then I noticed this van. It was parked across the street, trying to look inconspicuous. I saw the driver slide down in his seat, as if he was trying to avoid being seen. I couldn't make out the details, but I could see that he was an older man with a dark complexion and short black hair. Trying not to stare for too long, I committed this creeper van to my memory. It was white, with tinted windows, no company markings, and no front driver's license plate. Red flags were going off in my head, but I pushed away the feeling. I walked another block or 2, and I see this same van creeping up a side street. I get a nervous chill, though I press on, trying my best not to look frightened. After another couple of blocks, I see this van again. I didn't like where this situation was heading, So I stood my ground and faced the van, staring straight into the man's face and waiting for his reaction to me noticing him. To my horror, he gets out of the van, slamming the door behind him. He was a short Hispanic man, I would say 5'4", about 150 pounds, shorter than me, but definitely bigger. My mind is racing as he runs across the road towards me. I'm frozen to the spot. I wasn't expecting this. As soon as he reaches me, he starts speaking in broken English, but I can mostly understand him. He compliments me. He says he likes my hair, piercings, freckles, and my ass. Oh joy. Extremely uncomfortable by this point, I awkwardly thanked him. He then propositioned me for sex. I nearly choked and asked him to repeat himself. Not sure if I was hearing him correctly. But he pulled out $200 from his wallet and offered it to me if I would have sex with him. I take a step back, harshly telling him that I'm not that kind of girl, and he's barking up the wrong tree. I turn around, and as I did, he grabs my ass. I then speed walk away from this man, trying my best not to panic and formulate a plan. The man follows me, waving the $200 around like it would convince me to go back. I run to the first door I see and yank it open. As soon as I rush in, I run directly into a bouncer. I then fall back on my ass with a yelp. The bouncer helps me up and asks me why I was in such a hurry. I'm still in shock at this point, and he asks me to see my ID. I look around and I realize that I'm in a pub. I then tell him on the verge of tears that I'm only 19, and I was trying to hide from a man who was following me outside. I'm practically having a panic attack as the bouncer guides me to the bar and fetches me a glass of water. The bouncer wanted a description of the man. He tells me to hang tight and disappears out the door. After a few long minutes, he returns and tells me that the man won't be a problem anymore, but I am still reasonably frightened. The bouncer then asked me where I was heading. I checked the GPS on my phone, and I was only 2 blocks away from my boyfriend's job. The bouncer then clocks out on his break and offers to walk me the remaining 2 blocks. I beamed and latched on to the man's arm, thanking him profusely. He pats my head and laughs, and he told me never to walk down Colfax Avenue alone again, and I promised him that I would not repeat this mistake. When we arrived at my boyfriend's job, I thanked the bouncer again and sent him on his way. I explained what happened to my boyfriend, and he laughed at me. Perhaps I deserved that. But no one had warned me of the dangers of that road. I ended up not taking him to dinner that night, and I never walked that street alone again. So to the man in the creeper van, stay the fuck away from me, and keep your $200 for something less creepy. Before I begin, I would like to preface by stating that I'm a 23-year-old female, and I currently attend a graduate school in the Midwest. Earlier this year, I attended a research conference in New Orleans with 4 other grad students in my academic program. In order to save money, all of us decided to rent out an Airbnb for the duration of the conference, instead of staying at a hotel. We ended up finding a really nice studio apartment, about a mile away from downtown New Orleans. The apartment was rather small, and contained 2 queen-size beds as well as a futon. Our party was 4 girls and 1 guy. I shared one of the beds with my friend Anna, and the 2 other girls, Megan and Caddy, shared the other bed. The other student, Ari, ended up having the futon all to himself. We decided to hit up downtown New Orleans shortly after unpacking and settling into the Airbnb. After exploring the area and hitting up a few bars, we decided to head back and call it a night, as we had to be present at the conference early the next morning. All of us hit the sack shortly after returning back to the Airbnb. I woke up a couple of hours later to a creaking sound. At first, I thought it was nothing, but then I saw the apartment doors slowly open, and a man in a black hoodie came inside. I allowed the panic to set in, and I immediately woke up Anna. When she was awake, I pointed out the man. He was slowly walking towards us. Anna asked me, "Who is that?" I don't know," I responded. She got out of bed to get a better look at the guy. "Can we help you?" The man just stood there in silence. He then made his way over to Megan and Caddy's bed. who were both fast asleep. He then proceeded to climb on top of them. My heart was now racing faster than ever, but I couldn't move as I was paralyzed in fear.
Ari, why are you in our bed?
I heard Caddy groan. Then Megan woke up and yelled,
Ari, what the fuck are you doing? Get out of our bed!
Megan, that's not Ari, I said in a trembling voice. Ari was still asleep on the futon despite all of the commotion. The man was basically on top of Megan and Caddy, who were screaming hysterically at this point and desperately trying to get him off. I told Anna to wake Ari up, and she immediately ran over to him and started shaking him. I heard her say,
Ari, wake up! There's a man in Caddy and Megan's bed right now. You need to help us. What? That's crazy,
Ari said, still half asleep. I got out of the bed and grabbed my phone. I immediately called 911, and I told the operator to send help as soon as possible. While I was on the phone, I saw Ari get up and turn on the light. He ran over and pulled the man off of Caddy and Megan.
Get the fuck off them!
Ari yelled and threw the man to the ground. I managed to get a better look at the intruder once the lights were on. He was bald and had a very thick beard. He was also missing several teeth. He began to laugh hysterically once he was on the ground. Megan and Caddy both huddled together in the corner of the apartment, while Anna stood behind Ari. We were all very frightened. Once the police arrived, they gathered all of our information and escorted the man out of the apartment. Needless to say, the frightening and traumatic experience pretty much ruined our stay in New Orleans. I still have nightmares about the man to this day. Please be sure to keep your doors locked. You never know who might want to stop by for a nightly visit.
There's always a reason to be afraid.